I think the majority of people know who I am, Josh Decker, director of the MPS program here at USC. And it's our pleasure and privilege to have Dan Cameron here with us tonight from New York and from New Orleans. Dan is our second speaker in the series. You have posters in all your seats, and Dan's gonna do his presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for discussion, Q&A, conversation, and we're gonna wrap up by 8:30 tonight. I'm going to read Dan's bio. This is an abbreviated one, but it's nevertheless extensive, and it's important to represent all the various kinds of activities that Dan has been involved in as a curator and as an organizer, and in other capacities. Dan is the founder and artistic director of US Biennale Incorporated, a not-for-profit organization that produces Prospect New Orleans, a new international biennial whose first edition opened in November 2008. And this is the catalog, for those of you that are not already familiar with Prospect One catalog. I know quite a few of the students have already been engaged with this. Opened in November 2008 at multiple sites around New Orleans and closed in January 2009. Since 2007, Dan has also served as Director of Visual Arts for the Contemporary Arts Center, CAC New Orleans, which served as the principal venue for Prospect One. At CAC, Dan presented solo projects by artists such as Luis Cruz Azaceta, Tony Feher, and Peter Saul, as well as the group exhibitions Something from Nothing, Make It Right, previously on Piety, and Hot Up Here. Dan was senior curator at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York from 1995 to 2006, where his exhibitions included survey and new work exhibitions of Eugenio Ditteborn, Carol Denham, Teresita Fernandez, William Kentridge, Silva Mireles, Los Carpinteros, Nalini Malani, Christian Marclay, Paul McCarthy, Jun Yoongun Hatsushiba, Marcel Odenbach, Pierre and Gilles, Faith Ringgold, Doris Salcedo, Carolee Schneemann, Francesco Vizzoli, David Wojnarowicz, Martin Wong, Zhu Bing, among others. While at the New Museum, he also organized the group exhibitions East Village, USA, and Living Inside the Grid. I think I saw all of those exhibitions, actually. In 2003, Dan served as artistic director for the 8th Istanbul Biennial, entitled Poetic Justice. And in 2006, he co-organized the 10th Taipei Biennial, entitled Dirty Yoga. In 2006, he was the curator of, quote, New York Interrupted at PKN Gallery Beijing, the first independent exhibition of recent American art in China. In 2008, as guest curator for the Orange County Museum of Art, he presented a 5-decade retrospective of American painter Peter Saul. He currently serves as senior curator for the Next Wave Visual Art at Brooklyn Academy of Music, BAM, where he's organized an annual exhibition of emerging Brooklyn-based artists since 2002. He's also a member of the graduate faculty of the School of Visual Arts in New York, SVA, where he teaches an MFA symposium each spring. Some of Dan's better-known early exhibitions include Extended Sensibilities, 1982 at the New Museum, Art and Its Double, 1986-87 at the Fundación La Caixa, Barcelona and Madrid, What is Contemporary Art, 1989 at the Roseum Malmo in Sweden, The Savage Garden, 1991 at La Caixa again in Madrid, and Cocido e Crudo, or The Raw and the Cooked, or is it actually the other way around, The Cooked and the Raw, thank you, 1994 at the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Besides organizing major exhibitions in cities like Moscow, Mexico City, Valencia, Vienna, Cape Town, Rio de Janeiro, and Los Angeles, he's a frequently published writer on contemporary art with hundreds of museums' catalogs, essays, book texts, and magazine articles to his credit. His most recent publications include critical essays for Alejandre Arachea, I believe, or, okay. Todo Algo Nada, 2009, Centered Art, Caja de Burgos in Spain, or Burgos. Nick Cave, Meet Me at the Center of the Earth, 2009, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, San Francisco, and Skylar Fine, okay. Quote, Youth Manifesto, 2009, New Orleans Museum of Art. Anyway, these are just some of the exhibitions, activities that Dan has been involved in now for a number of decades, and he looks basically exactly the same as when I first met him, probably in the 1980s, somewhere in the East Village. So, which is great. So it's my, no, okay, yeah. It's my pleasure, hardly. It's my pleasure to have Dan Cameron here today, and please welcome him.
Thanks, Josh. I really gave him the extended biography so that it would pad my own remarks and make it seem like I was actually going to talk longer. Thank you for the great introduction. It's good to be in front of a group like this. Josh and I sat down about a month ago and talked about the program, which I have to say I didn't really know that much about prior to deciding to come here and talk to you. And since that time, I guess I've really been thinking a lot about your curriculum. I had never really, I think, understood public art practice in terms of my own curatorial work, but of course, once I started to look at it in a certain way, it began to, I think, take on certain emphases that turn out to be maybe pertinent to what I'm talking about tonight, and also, I think, your curriculum. Josh asked me, in part, to also talk about where I come from. I know that some of you are curators, or you want to be curators, and I guess for me, I mean, to sort of come from a museum background and have done so much on the international circuit, I think doesn't necessarily give credit to just how precarious the life of a young, and the career of a young curator is. Those first 5 or 10 years when you're out in the field trying to do things, trying to get work, really are the things that shape your experience. And I guess for me, when I look back on the early 80s, which is when I first came to New York, when Josh and I were both teenagers, right? Yeah, more or less. I had finished, probably my first exhibition that I really think of as notable was this exhibition called Extended Sensibilities at the New Museum in 1982. I had moved to New York in 1979 and began volunteering to the New Museum immediately, along with my kind of 9-to-5 job. And it quickly became possible for me to make a proposal, an exhibition proposal to them, just based on conversations in this very small office with Marcia Tucker, who had been the founder and for more than 20 years the director of the museum. And we began joking about different ideas. She said, oh, maybe you should do an exhibition of the horse in art. And I said, well, no, I think what I really want to do is an exhibition about the color green. And it just went on like this, back and forth. And one day I came in and I said, well, there is something I really would like to make an exhibition about, Marcia. And it's gay and lesbian sensibility in contemporary art. And she gasped and kind of looked at me. And she said, really? You really want to do this? And I said, well, it's a really interesting topic to me. And it probably wasn't until the museum had actually committed itself to doing the exhibition that I began to think about what the repercussions were going to be. I mean, in the early 80s, this is the pre-AIDS era. It really wasn't all that professionally cool to be out. And I think what the exhibition in a way did was kind of push museum practice and sociocultural identity into an area which the New Museum became very famous for in the 80s and later into the 90s. And I like to think that even though many people told me during the process of putting the exhibition together that, that this would be my last exhibition in a museum because nobody really wanted to see this kind of subject matter in art museums, I think the number of exhibitions dealing with the subject matter in the meantime, and then of course the effect of AIDS on the New York contemporary art community and finally the rest of the world as well, certainly gives the whole thing a very different slant. So since 1982, I think that's really been kind of what I've made my career about, is trying to find interstices between what is established as mainstream curatorial practice and the things that most interest me. And I personalize it because I think that that is, in the end, how most of us make our decisions. They tend to be very subjective, and especially when you're dealing with the kind of subject matter that I find myself increasingly working with, and which we'll get to in Prospect 1, I think that the notion that there is something called political art, and that political art has a specific resonance in the world, or that curatorial practice itself is a socio-political activity. I think that's something that really needs to be examined. I don't think we can necessarily accept kind of put in whole cloth this idea of a pre-established socio-political domain. I think it's something that needs to be contested over and over again. And I'm particularly interested in the idea that in a very real-world context, what we often think about as being political, in fact, takes on, I think, a completely different sort of tenor. So I'm going to kill the lights and talk to you a little bit about the project that I think is maybe the most germane to New Orleans, and that was the Istanbul Biennial in 2003. I had been going to the Istanbul Biennial since '95, since the first one that I was able to go to as the New Museum's curator, and to say that it had an impact on my practice would be to understate things drastically. I think I saw 3 biennials in maybe this 8 years before I actually did one. And the only reason I didn't go to the one in 2001 was because it opened on September 13th, 2001. I had my plane ticket and everything, but no planes were leaving New York during that week, and certainly not going to the Middle East. So Ground Zero was still smoking when they called me from Istanbul and asked me to organize an exhibition, and I thought, wow, you know, America's just had its worst terrorist attack in its history, and here is an Islamic country, democracy, but nonetheless, certainly a completely Islamic modern democracy, calling me up and saying, would you do an international biennial here? What I didn't know at the time was that during the development of the biennial, of course, the United States would invade Iraq, the occupation of Iraq would begin to disintegrate quite violently during the summer of 2003, so that by the time the exhibition opened in October, no one, I think, had any longer had any feeling, if anyone had at that time, at least in circles that I moved, that this was ever going to end well or end soon. So the reason I chose poetic justice as my theme was because I was tracking the public opinion in Turkey about the invasion of Iraq, and noticed that the percentage of people who disapproved started at 95%. And then as it got closer and closer to the invasion, it was pretty much 99%. So the number, we had a society bordering Iraq in which pretty much every single citizen was vehemently against the war. I decided that as an American, it was really important for me to be upfront about my own politics, and especially to try to create a construct for the meaning of the biennial in which the notion of poetic justice could be kind of unpacked and looked at in a number of different ways, so that poetry, which is of course essential to meaning and law in the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, and finally, I think, in Islam overall. And then finally, the idea of justice, that the United States was dispensing a kind of rough justice that it felt the rest of the world simply needed to adhere to or adjust to, that there was simply no ability to go against it. And I thought, well, what is the role of the artist in a situation like this? And as the exhibition developed, what I began to understand was that this idea of the exhibition as a kind of a manifesto, a kind of a public demonstration of a form of resistance, is something that can be presented in a number of different ways. And I guess as I'm going through, I want to sort of note that, well, let's go back one step. Note that my taste as a curator is resolutely pluralistic. I do not accept stylistic distinctions that I think are more or less rote in the field. I mix painting with conceptual art. I mix installation with traditional art. I'm not really, in fact, I'm not only not concerned with these movements, I try very hard to make my work completely violate whatever kind of accepted idea of a single aesthetic perspective might be. So I'm just going to show you 2 sites from Istanbul, and then some public works, and then I'm going to really segue and talk directly about New Orleans. This is the Entrepot warehouse. It's actually on the Bosphorus River. It was constructed by the US Army Corps of Engineers, who seem to keep coming back in my life, in the 50s as a customs warehouse. And by the time René Bloch used it in '95 for the biennial, one of the warehouses had been used primarily just for raves at New Year's. And it was a very dramatic and beautiful space, about 40,000 square feet per floor. And so we had about, I would say about a third of the exhibition in the Entrepot. These are the interior spaces on the upper floor, which is open to the river and gets a lot of natural light. I worked with an architect from Madrid, who I've collaborated with a lot in the past, to create these sort of open spaces where as much of the exhibition can be viewed from any point in the space as possible. So, and this, just because I'm not going to pause on this work, the orange piece that you're seeing connecting the upper floor with yet another floor that's implied but not actually there is Doho Su, who made the entire thing out of translucent nylon. I invited Anne Hamilton to be part of this exhibition, and I thought, gee, that's a uncreative gesture in a way, but I felt that for me, there was something important about Hamilton's work that, you know, seems to kind of get swept under the rug a little when one is actually thinking of her work in terms of contemporary art practice. And I thought that, especially the sorts of environments that she's created in the past are very conducive to what I was trying to explore with the idea of poetic justice. So I approached her about the exhibition, and she claimed a very long space, about 2 naves wide, 2 kind of square sections wide, and about 4 long, so about 2,000 square feet, in which an arrangement of curtains is on a series of rods that all can conduct themselves electrically through the space. At certain prearranged points, the entire arrangement of the curtains moves and shifts within the space. So the architecture, which at one point might be blocking one side of the room, suddenly forms compartments that the viewers can stand in. A few minutes later, it will rearrange itself again so that the room is actually looking in the opposite direction of where it faced an hour before. So this kind of transformation of the exhibition space into a kind of shifting physical reality was echoed by the work of Monika Sosnowski from Poland, who turned one corner of the exhibition area into this gradually narrowing hallway. She wanted it to look like a high school in Poland, this kind of anonymous public space, institutional space. So you entered through what looked like it could look like a hospital door, perhaps, went down the hallway and turned to the right. And as you turned to the right, you noticed that the hallway had just narrowed by about 1.5 feet. You got to the end of that hallway, turned again, the hallway, it narrowed one more time, and as you kept turning around, the hallway became more and more impassable, to the point where you suddenly were in this impossible space where you just looked down the corridor and saw more doorways, but no more ability to move inside of the space. I'm going to skip Lukaski's work right now. Minerva Cuevas, whose work may be familiar to many of you, created a miniature, or actually had commissioned a miniature in the size really about 14 inches, say, by 20 inches. And what she did was worked with traditional painters and got them all to single out scenes of political protests over the last, say, 5 or 10 years in Turkey. There is a military dictatorship that still kind of sits in the background and forms a deep political structure just in case things become unstable, at which point they move in periodically, throw out the democracy, and impose a military dictatorship. This hasn't happened for some years, but certainly in our lifetimes it's happened enough times so that no one ever seems completely certain that democracy is around permanently. So what Cuevas did was take certain scenes, well-known scenes in Turkish life where there are confrontations between the military and protesters over public assembly laws, which are very, very strict in Turkey. Collaged these images together without identifying any of them, put the painting itself on display in the entrepot, but more importantly had hundreds of posters made up, quite large scale, and one night had them placed throughout bus stops all over Istanbul. So suddenly people waking up in the morning had this image with no identification, no tie to the biennial, but these strangely recognizable images of protests that had been broken up by the military dictatorship. I'm going to again skip through a little bit. There's the Dohosu I was mentioning to you before. Andrei Kulincic wanted to kind of transform one part of the gallery into a public learning system because she had developed an internet game or an interactive questionnaire called Distributive Justice, which is a little bit like a SimCity program where you essentially fill out a menu of things you would like in your ideal democracy, in your ideal society. Do you have absolute press freedom? Do you have absolute freedom of religious faith? How do you tax? How do you distribute land and property? And then what happens is the program kind of crunches all that information and tells you what kind of society you've actually developed along the way. So whereas you thought your impulses might be utopian, in the end you've created an authoritarian state without even being aware of it. The exhibition was multidisciplinary in the sense that it had 3 times a week meetings in the artist space where professors, mostly from faculties of the various universities around Istanbul, would come in and lead discussions about democracy and especially how social justice kind of figures into contemporary art practice, but as this exists in a more public discursive sphere in contemporary Turkish life. I'm going to skip etc. Surasi Kusawong from Bangkok, or from Thailand originally, is an artist who's interested me a lot in the past for creating these sort of free distribution systems in exhibition spaces. He's probably best known for setting up Thai massage stations in large international biennials so that exhausted visitors can take a break, lie down, and get a nice rub down in the process. He decided that for Turkey, what he wanted to do was follow up on a particular Thai export, Thai boxing, and see how that exists in a country like Turkey today. And of course, Thai boxing, which has really swept the world, is no less popular in Turkey than anywhere else. So he decided to stage a boxing match on the opening day of the biennial. And in Thai boxing, the public are the ones who decide who the winner is. There's no judge. The spectator votes, and they vote by handing in a blue or a red chip for the one they think did the best onto a set of scales, which are then weighed. So this idea of a public sporting match entering into the contemporary art arena, I think was kind of beautifully modulated by really leaving both the training area, where the documentary film of the match was presented during the run of the biennial, and the actual sparring area with the what was left over from the judging intact. So one more on this. Okay, no, I have a couple more to just describe from this floor. Jorge Maki of Buenos Aires, an artist I've collaborated with a lot, created an interactive map of the city of Buenos Aires, which he developed a specific system. He laid a piece of glass over a map of Buenos Aires and dropped a rock on the glass. The resulting cracks in the glass created a second map. So he used those cracks to trace a walking tour onto Buenos Aires, and that was the mapping project. He then took the walking tour, with a number of collaborators, a composer, an urban historian, and a cartographer, and made this walking tour of Buenos Aires that really does not correspond in any way to the thoroughfares, to the sites of historical interest, or to any of the main passages through the city. It'd be sort of a random tour, which nonetheless focuses on highlights, auditory, visual, and textual of the tour that the artist took with his collaborators. Keep skipping a little bit. And then Can Altay from Ankara had been working for a couple of years on a project which was quite striking to me about the papermen society in Ankara. Turkey does not have a recycling system, and Istanbul has some issues dealing with waste and recyclables. But Ankara, the capital, is spick and span. There is not a scrap of paper or cardboard or glass or bottles anywhere on the streets. And the reason for that is that there's a gray market industry. Every night, a couple of hundred people whose life's work centers around creating this recycling system simply sweep through the city, pick everything up, and by dawn it's all packaged and resold. And they go back to, they go to sleep, and the population of Ankara swarms onto the city again and messes it up one more time. So the documentation of this shadow world, how an industry has formed around the need to recycle, and this opportunity that opens up in a modern industrial society that pollutes a lot and actually has the economic capabilities of buying recycled materials, I thought was very revealing. So I'm going to switch over to another venue, namely the Hagia Sophia. This is, of course, one of the architectural masterpieces of the world, and it was never used for contemporary art, and I'm not sure it's ever going to be used again for contemporary art, but it just so happened that 2003 was the 550th anniversary of the expulsion of the infidel from the empire, what we think of as the fall of the city of Constantinople in 1453. So for some reason, the fact that we were on an anniversary date made it possible to create a number of interventions in the Hagia Sophia space, which I'm just going to kind of walk you through right now. This is an installation by Tsuyoshi Ozawa. It's a series that he's done over the years. He is one of the most influential conceptually based artists in Japan. As far as I know, he's never had an exhibition in the United States. Vegetable Weapon is from a series of documentation of meals that are created for him, which he commissions as he travels around the world. Before the meals are created, the person who buys the groceries poses for a formal photographic portrait, while they brandish the groceries as weapons. And then the weapon groceries are made into dinner, everyone eats the dinner, and only the portrait remains. This was set up as a kind of greenhouse environment in the middle of the Hagia Sophia. Araya Raschamransuk, another Thai artist, her work was actually creating some consternation on the part of not the authorities for the church or the mosque, but actually the biennial organizers, who really thought that because the current Islamist party had just been voted in, and the directorship of the Hagia Sophia kept changing as the opening date of the biennial approached, the Araya's practice, which deals with writing texts for the recently deceased, and then going to city morgues and collaborating with corpses, either dressing them or talking to them or reciting literary works to them, really as a way of accompanying them, say, in the passage from life to death. Her position really is that societies that overemphasize the distinction between life and death rob themselves to some degree of the richness of life, and so she felt that when people are traumatized by the death of someone around them or in the community, they never stop to think how traumatic their own grief is on the recently deceased, who has it tough enough, face it, having just died, to also have to put up with the mourning of the people they've left behind. So a lot of Araya's practice has to do with kind of finding the space between the living and the dead, and creating a whole poetic and literary practice about it. What was great to me is, like, once I actually got to sit down and explain to religious authorities, it was quite beautiful, what her work meant to me anyway. They thought it was fantastic. They were delighted that something dealing with Buddhist practice would be shown in the middle of the Hagia Sophia, which has not been a religious institution for many, many years. Kendall Gears, also an artist, very, very active in the international art circuit, completely unknown in the United States, created a work in which he took the largest LED light that he could find and simply turned it upside down and placed it in one of the main portals, so that it looked a little bit like a train clock in a station where you couldn't actually read anything. You knew that, I mean, the numerals were all identifiable, but if you didn't get that it was upside down, it might not occur to you right away. In fact, people kept asking him, like, how did you rewire, you know, the digital clock in such a way? And twice a day, the letters clearly spell out hell, which I think is also something that was very appealing to him. But I don't actually have a photo of hell, but it's at like 11:34, right? When you turn it upside down. Marepe from northern Brazil created a large sort of ping pong environment, or sorry, tiddlywinks game and interactive space in one of the more open areas of the mosque. What he called a blind toy, where people would simply use these springs to toss coins into a central area and then fish them out again. A very sort of carefree and meaningless practice, but one that I think was very much relevant to the kind of tourism that goes on in a space that was once central to the philosophical meanings of the spaces. So I'm going to show you three more public projects, and then I'm going to say goodbye to Istanbul for now. Rogelio Lopez Cuenca from Malaga, I think one of the most significant artists working in Spain today. Sorry to keep saying this, but completely unknown in this country. Had created a piece in the 1992 World's Fair in Sevilla that I very much liked, which was essentially public signage that leads you to nonsensical or poetic or impossible destinations, but certainly don't take you where you want to go. So he created a number of signs that he placed throughout public spaces in Istanbul, really reminders of places in the world where there's an active military conflict going on. The piece was censored about 3 days into the exhibition because he didn't tell us, but he slipped in the word Kurdistan in one of the signs. And that was it. That was all it took for the military to come in and say, that work no longer exists. We never found out what happened to the signs, but they were gone almost instantly. Sildo Morelos, I think one of the great artists of our time, created a 4-bedroom apartment at one of the busiest intersections in the city, the Istiklal Çadesi. It's mostly a pedestrian zone, but cars do come up and down. The idea of the 4 bedrooms is that each one is separated by the street that intersects. So you have a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, but to get from any room to another room, you actually have to go outside and cross the street and go back in again. So it was a fascinating work because it really brought people in from these urban zones into a kind of private space or domesticated space for just a moment and allowed, whoops, sorry. And then this is probably the work that was maybe best known from the project. Doris Salcedo, again an artist that I've worked with pretty consistently for the last 20 years, which is not typical of my own practice. But she wanted to do something in Istanbul that dealt with how difficult it is to perceive when a society goes from peace to war sometimes. In particular, there was an expulsion of Greeks and Jews from Istanbul in the late 40s, about a few years after World War II that really changed the makeup of society forever. It was done through taxation, but it was unmistakably an attempt to get certain people out of the society. So what she did is to create this almost impossible fusion, a kind of a situation in which what seems to be a form of stability is unsustainable. In this case, by taking 1,600 chairs and packing a space where a building used to be to the point where there is no gap, there's no space anymore. In fact, it was incredibly well engineered so that the plane running along the street front was exactly as smooth as a storefront would have been. So you had this kind of chaos or density of forms, of human forms, jammed into the space, looking again like this kind of perfect halfway point between order and chaos. So I'm going to end this here and switch right over to, I think, what the kind of main topic is going to be. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit, I want to go back a little bit to my own story. Right at the end of the 80s is the period when Josh was giving you my history. At a time when I was working a lot in Europe. I had a successful exhibition called El Arte Sudoble that opened up at the La Caixa in Barcelona and Madrid. And suddenly I went from being a completely struggling, unknown, underemployed curator and art critic in New York to having a hit, having a really big and extremely well-received project in Europe, as a result of which I basically could work for the next 10, 15 years in Europe. Mind you. That very same year I went to New Orleans for the first time. Peter Halley, who had been a friend and colleague in the East Village, had gone to the University of New Orleans for his graduate work and stayed close to an art dealer there who was having an exhibition in May of 1987. I was invited down as part of kind of a junket just to come along, and somebody told me just beforehand, oh, you'll really enjoy it because Jazz Fest is going on. I didn't really know what Jazz Fest was, but it turned out that Sunday, after all of the festivities, was the final day of this music festival. So I went out and had a look. Probably around 6 o'clock that evening, about an hour before the festival ended, I had a kind of epiphany. I don't think there's another word to describe it, where I had a soft shell crab po' boy in one hand and probably a beer in the other, and there was pot smoke everywhere. The Neville brothers were performing and the sun was starting to set. And I was standing there as a Yankee and feeling that really I had never been fully alive up until that moment. That's really the only way to describe it. And people who know New Orleans at this point in my talk usually go, yes, we understand. There's this idea of pleasure, of sensual pleasure coming at me in several directions at once, really kind of went against everything that was in my character as a Yankee, where, you know, in New York we take our pleasures one at a time. You don't watch a concert while eating a corned beef sandwich. You know, it's one thing, you know, you don't have chocolate and sex at this, well, maybe you do. But the idea that in New Orleans, pleasure is experienced in this kind of polyvocal way, or maybe the right word is polymorphously perverse way, really was a shock to my system. And really from that day forward, I think that part of my life, part of my construct of myself, was that at least once a year, and usually twice a year, I would go to New Orleans. So from 1987 until 2009, I've never missed a Jazz Fest. I'm 24 years and going, I'm hoping to like break a record. And somewhere along the way, I got very involved in the art scene. Friends of mine who were artists, who were curators, who were involved in museums, who were themselves artists, all of these kinds of friendships started forming I would say, a shadow version of my New York life, so that even though I didn't really work in New Orleans, my friends were more or less equivalent to my friends in New York, the only difference being that I came to New Orleans to escape the art world, to get away, to just have fun and disappear into this kind of, well, what I discovered was a very, very dependable source of ecstatic enjoyment of life. So when Katrina happened, or rather when after Katrina left and the levees, which had never been that stable to begin with, just collapsed and flooded 80% of the city, most of the city for more than 2.5 weeks. So there was that standing flood water for 2.5 weeks. I was really, I was torn between thinking that maybe the city I had known and grown to love was never going to be there for me again, that this kind of part of my life had finished. And I remember having thought, like as far back maybe as 2000, you know, this is clearly the place I want to end my days. This is like the perfect place to go when when you get to your 70s and 80s and you can't take, your bones can't take the cold anymore. This is what I've always understood, that this is something that happens, at which point you seek warmer climates like San Diego or Miami or New Orleans. So I had already made up my mind that this was going to be part of my life, and then there it was. It seemed to be gone. Well, my phone started ringing probably, well, definitely within a week that the levees failed. And one friend started calling me from Baton Rouge, somebody else was in Houston, somebody else was in New York, and the conversations were all sort of similar. Everyone was putting a very brave face on the situation and saying, when we go back and when we start to rebuild the city, that was how the conversations were always prefaced, we're going to have to do some cultural rebuilding as well. The infrastructure of the culture of the city really is going to need some desperate attention. And the art world in New Orleans seemed particularly precarious at that moment. It seemed that every artist one knew had lost their home, or their studio, or both, or in many cases their life's work, or some very large portion of their life's work. So the collective trauma that just the visual arts community in New Orleans was suffering was really quite mind-boggling. Well, all of these friends said to me, you know, Dan, you seem to love New Orleans. Why don't you come down and be part of this conversation that we're going to have? And so I feel in a way that I was kind of lured in because my first post-Katrina visit in January of 2006 consisted of 2 activities on the first day. I went to the Lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans East, Chalmette, St. Bernard Parish, all the areas that you all remember from the news reports, and toured neighborhoods that no longer resembled neighborhoods at all. I mean, what they resembled were places that had been firebombed. I mean, I remember thinking, oh, must have been what Dresden looked like, you know, in 1945. Or maybe Nagasaki is a better comparison, but this idea that you, as far as the eye could see, was total devastation. And wherever we would drive, in certain directions, you would just go blocks and get out, and it was the same. And then you get back and drive and go blocks more and get out, and it was the same. And it was unrelenting, this emptiness, this loss for the community. So I was completely thrown, not really prepared for all this. But I remember thinking afterwards, the scale of this, simply the scale is so overwhelming that whatever is done, you know, whatever happens to the city really has to, in a way, reflect that kind of scale. And the reason I mention that is because later that day, I went to a kind of town hall meeting in which a couple hundred people were filling a large space, and there were 3 of us, all kind of out-of-towners, who love New Orleans, Rick Powell, who heads the art history department at Duke, and a couple of people you probably don't know. And we all just talked about what our ideas were. And at one point, the person next to me, who was not from the art world, said that the tourists, when they come back to New Orleans, would solve the situation because the tourists would buy art, and then the artists would have money, and everything would be fine. And I remember listening to this thinking, that's really weird that he would say that, and looking out in the audience and people were kind of shaking their heads or looking despondent, and finally I thought, you know what, let's go back. Tourists don't buy art. Let's start there. Tourists buy tchotchkes. So whatever it is that tourists are going to do in this idea, it doesn't have anything to do with the lives of artists. And really just to respond to this person on the panel, I said, what would really make a difference in New Orleans if you wanted to help the art community is to bring collectors, bring curators, bring thousands of artists, bring critics, bring museum people, like people that really understand art, bring them to New Orleans, and then you might have something happen that could really, really benefit the art community. And people were kind of interested in that, and I said, well, like an art fair, except not an art fair, because no one collects art in New Orleans, or at least there aren't any collectors the way we think of as Miami collectors, or LA collectors, or New York collectors. And I said, but you could maybe do something like a biennial in the city. You know, that would actually work, because New Orleans seems to have that kind of ambiance where a biennial would really, you know, function. And people said, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And the panel went on, and it was finished, and everyone went home. And later on that night, as I was going out to eat with my friends, somebody said, were you serious about that? And I said, well, I just blurted it out, but now that I've blurted it out, it seems like a really, really good idea. And by the next day, my subconscious had been working on the idea, and it was clear that not only would New Orleans get a biennial, but that I was going to do it, and that really I was going to probably do it in a way where I could devote 10 years of my life to the cultural rebuilding of New Orleans, but my contribution would be to kind of create something that would be a bridge between this city, where no one in the art world has ever been before, because it's just so poor and southern. Poor and southern, I think, is enough. Really, no one in the art world had ever been to New Orleans. And I had been trying to get people to come to Jazz Fest, and they were like, why would we go to New Orleans? It's so poor and southern. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. And so finally I just said, you know, maybe if we created something that the entire art world would want to come to New Orleans, like a biennial that really made a difference, then suddenly this appreciation of what New Orleans is to the rest of the country, how essential New Orleans is to the cultural identity of the United States, and in a way look at our history, like what's happened to the art world since the capitalization of the art market in the 80s. Cities like New Orleans, which had a character, a historic flavor, an amazing culture of their own, were more or less forgotten. You know, the era of Keith Saunier and Tina Gerard and you know, this generation moving from Louisiana to New York and having this exchange between these two kind of cultural capitals, that was over. It was no longer possible. But I thought, well, maybe it could happen again. Maybe what I feel about this city isn't so bizarre, but that if we get artists excited about working in New Orleans, they create good works, then the rest of the art world will get involved. So here's New Orleans. One of the things that I think you cannot possibly ignore is the presence of water in every aspect of what New Orleans is. Obviously, it's on the Mississippi River, but it also is that it's the mouth of the Gulf of the mouth of the Delta. So the emptying out of the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, and with all the implied transatlantic passages, is why New Orleans was built where it is. 40% of all of the rainfall, the flow from continental United States, goes into the Mississippi and dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. And for more than 150 years, New Orleans was the largest port in the United States. What else can we say about it? I think the cultural weight that the city has had on America was largely forgotten about by the second half of the 20th century. So things like the introduction of grand opera, of European opera to American society happened through New Orleans. Before New York had built a single opera house, New Orleans had 3 of them. The recurring contemporary international art exhibition, which we think was born in this country through the Carnegie International, actually started in the 1880s in New Orleans, when the annual art exhibition of the Artist Society had regular representation from France, Germany, Italy, and England. So this idea that New Orleans was once this hub of society really has, you could say that the Civil War created kind of a mortal wound into the fabric of the South. And then as the 20th century created these kind of mega urban structures like Houston and Miami that really became giants of industry, and of course New Orleans lost almost all of its oil, not to mention its oil rights for pumping out of the Gulf of Mexico. The city lost 80% of its wealth during the 20th century. So that's an incredible statistic, and of course you can't expect a city that's that much part of its past to continue to be a cultural powerhouse in our time. Everything in New Orleans is wet all the time. If you dig 8 inches into your backyard, water will come up. The idea that a pumping system keeps a lot of this water at bay doesn't really change the reality that this is soggy ground. Even the highest points in the city are still below sea level, so that when you're standing in areas that have never flooded in the history of the city, you still look at ships going down the Mississippi and they're over your head by 20 feet. It's quite alarming. And of course this swamp backwater, these bayous that just seem to define the landscape, and the swamp areas throughout southern Louisiana have really created its own sort of Gothic literature and culture that I think has remained a part of the American collective unconscious, but in a way that's not so much acknowledged during our time. So if we can talk about the cultural identity of New Orleans, and I think we can, I often like to say that it is built on 3 legs. It's like a 3-legged stool right now. The biggest part is architecture and history. You may not know it, but New Orleans has the largest concentration of 19th century houses of any place in the United States. That's just because many of these neighborhoods were never developed. But the fact remains that the poverty which kept a lot of these neighborhoods from being raised and transformed into middle-class suburban communities, it never came to New Orleans. What happened was, after '65, there was a lot of white flight out to the suburbs, so that the inner city part of New Orleans became kind of a isolated, insular environment. So there are hundreds and hundreds of houses like this Creole cottage that you see, and many people who come to New Orleans for the first time, what they first notice is how much it looks like a European city, and not at all like the rest of the United States. Of course, New Orleans cuisine is perhaps the best in America, in the sense that it seems to have fused so much of what is local with what is international. Of course, Creole French cooking was one of the biggest influences, but Caribbean cooking traditions, Spanish cooking traditions, Cajun cooking traditions, and of course African traditions all figured into this zone where the plenitude and quality of shellfish alone it's without comparison in the Northern Hemisphere. So the size of the shrimp and the crawfish, and the kind of way that very, very simple recipes have produced this exotic cuisine, I think draws thousands and thousands of tourists every year to New Orleans just to eat. And I think many of the most celebrated chefs in the United States are based in New Orleans, where I think really chefs rule the city along with trumpet players. My experience at Jazz Fest turns out to not be at all unique. The way that live music happens in the city of New Orleans is not like anywhere else in the United States. There are dozens of very intimate rooms where a population of the greatest per capita number of musicians of anywhere in the country play for audiences that are very often each other. The fact that musicians don't make very much money in New Orleans doesn't seem to slow down the influx of musicians to the city. It's a kind of a paradise for musicians. And of course, local vernacular musical traditions, starting with the street brass band, which are ubiquitous, and going up to the more marching brass bands, which are professional operations that are going on sometimes for generations. These form the lifeblood of a community that has been involved really in every indigenous American musical form since jazz. So funk, rock, folk, blues, hip hop, zydeco. None of this would have been the same without New Orleans involvement. Somebody once showed me a Billboard top 40 listing from 1958, a few years after the birth of rock and roll. And more than half the songs on this top 40 listing had all been recorded in New Orleans, because that was a time when New Orleans musicians were really dominant. So I live in New Orleans for a great part because of the music. I used to follow a lot of live music in New York in the early 80s. The scene changed. It no longer became it was no longer as intimate, it was no longer as friendly, but in New Orleans, when you go out to a club to hear music, you're really partaking in a cultural ritual that everyone involved understands the value and the meaning of, because it really is what holds the society together more than anything else. Because we're in Mardi Gras season, I have to slip in the obligatory reference to Mardi Gras. It's sort of the largest party in America. It's a party that the city of New Orleans throws for itself. There's no government sponsorship, there's no organization from a public body, there's absolutely no commercialization whatsoever of Mardi Gras, despite the fact that MTV has produced this image in most Americans that it really just consists of people throwing beads and telling women to expose their breasts on Bourbon Street, when in fact that's about as irrelevant to what most New Orleanians think of as Mardi Gras as could possibly be imagined. For the non-Catholics in the room, just a brief introduction here. You know, Easter is the season of this, the festival of rebirth in Catholicism. Lent precedes Easter, and in order to prepare yourself for Easter, you need to give something up. You need to repent and sacrifice something out of your life to get ready. The day that repentance starts is Ash Wednesday. That's when you see Catholics running around with black ashes on their foreheads. That's Ash Wednesday. The day before Ash Wednesday is Mardi Gras. That's the day when everything is celebrated with such intensity that really the city seems to explode. The first time I experienced Mardi Gras, I thought I had seen everything. But what I realized was that I was living in this village of people that just danced in the streets all day long on Mardi Gras. And it's really at the culmination of a 2.5-week season that began last Saturday in New Orleans with Crew de Vue, and we'll finish up on the 16th with the final celebration. And just before midnight on Mardi Gras, if you've got any more of those beads, the things you've been begging people to throw to you from floats in the parades, it's time to throw them away, because all those accumulated worldly goods mean nothing at that point. You have to cast them off and then start all over the next day by giving everything up. Now, why am I mentioning that? Well, it's because I think after Katrina, what happened was New Orleanians really found themselves thrown back on their own resources. And I think the subtext that's really important to mention here is that had the government not failed, and failed so thoroughly and spectacularly in coming to the aid of New Orleans after Katrina, I mean, had there been really even moderate success in terms of helping people, salvaging communities, rebuilding houses, none of what I did and none of what so many other people have done would be necessary. But in fact, we had the perfect misalignment with George Bush in the White House, Kathleen Blanco in the governor's house, and Ray Nagin in terms of helping people, salvaging communities, rebuilding houses. None of what I did and none of what so many other people have done would be necessary. But in fact, we had the perfect misalignment with George Bush in the White House, Kathleen Blanco in the governor's house, and Ray Nagin in City Hall. Incompetent, corrupt, and stupid. So what happened was New Orleans was simply abandoned in its hour of great need. And Robin Road, when he came to the city, really a full 2 years later, could not believe that he was driving around St. Bernard's Parish and seeing neighborhoods, entire neighborhoods that looked exactly the way they had looked just after the floods. That you could go to these once vibrant centers and nothing was fixed, nothing was repaired, and not only that, but the hulks, the bones, the remains of the society that had once been there were still just sitting there as kind of mute evidence to the state's failure to take care of its citizens. So here we were in the richest country in the world, watching our Venice, watching our greatest center, I think, of cultural history, a history that we've largely forgotten, admittedly, in the 20th century, because we've been too busy making money and making movies and making computers and you know, dealing with a revved up stock market to, I think, really pay any more attention to cultural roots that aren't somehow paying their own way in society. So when people came back to the lower Ninth Ward and, of course, started living in FEMA trailers, suddenly the plight of these tens of thousands of New Orleanians who did come back, we won't speak of the tens of thousands who will never come back, who have just left the city forever and are somewhere from Salt Lake City to Minneapolis to Fort Worth, they really had a very, very difficult struggle. So a lot of charities like Common Ground, Relief, sprang up in the wake of the first return of people to the neighborhood, and you found that this precariousness that people were living with on a day-to-day basis was really something that I think applied to the city as a whole. In the lower Ninth Ward in particular, the idea that people who had been homeowners for 2 or 3 generations but didn't have insurance and didn't have anything else were in some cases hundreds of miles away trying to protect homesteads that were in constant danger of being bulldozed was only one of the fears that people had. So this prevalence of no bulldozing signs sprung up all over the neighborhood. One of my closest friends, the chief curator from the New Orleans Museum of Art, was the world's expert in the work of Sister Gertrude Morgan, who, if anyone is interested in self-taught art, is really one of the principal self-taught artists in the United States of the 20th century. Sister Gertrude Morgan's house was in the lower Ninth Ward and had signs that said no bulldozing on every sign. They had a placard saying this is a National Historic Site. I can't remember what else they had, like every conceivable form of identification that a great artist lived here and this is a cultural heritage site in America. It was bulldozed from one day to the next. No one knows who did it, no one knows how, who gave the order. Suddenly, Sister Gertrude Morgan's house is no more. So this idea that something had to happen and somebody had to pay attention to the injustice being done to New Orleans was something I was experiencing hand in hand with this idea that, well, I don't know if anyone who doesn't love New Orleans really understands what a completely bizarre place this is and how truly strange and unusual its culture is. This image, I think, illustrates the typical New Orleans humor. You might know that after people got back, they were told that whatever they did, under no circumstances were they to open their refrigerators, right? This was several weeks passed with no electricity in 100-degree heat and 90% humidity. So the idea was you just had to tape up your refrigerator with gaffer's tape or duct tape and pull it out in front of your yard and just never ever think about what's growing inside. People who didn't do that really were sorry afterwards. So what happened? Well, with thousands of refrigerators in the streets of New Orleans, people started decorating them. Because that's what New Orleanians do. So suddenly you had contests and photo chapbooks published of who can make the prettiest refrigerators sitting in front of their house. And I particularly like You've Done a Great Job, Brownie. For those who don't remember, Michael Brown, the head of FEMA, the man who never ever had a job in public service, much less saving people, who completely failed on the job, was praised by President Bush about 4 days after the levees collapsed, saying, "You've done a heck of a job, Brownie." And those words still curdle in the ears of New Orleanians to this day. So, my idea for the biennial was to go big. I spent a lot of 2006 really treading water, trying to start something in New Orleans and realizing that a city that was really suffering the trauma of one of the worst disasters in our country's history, and with precious few resources to rebuild with, it was a little bit unseemly to try to start a charity operation that was raising money for art at the time when a lot of people didn't have schools, homes, or even enough to eat. So by the end of 2006, it became clear to me that I should think of this in a different way. And coincidentally, I was asked to meet with the philanthropic advisor to the Lewis family, Peter and Toby Lewis, He was the founder of Progressive Insurance, retired as a billionaire a few years ago, was for several years the very contentious president of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and fought tooth and nail with Thomas Krenz over the kind of expansion of the Guggenheim label all over the world. So the advisors asked me, was talking to me about a fund that Toby Lewis had for 10 years where she wanted to basically distribute $5 million a year. So it was a $50 million fund over 10 years. And she said, well, what do you think of this idea? What do you think of that idea? And in the end said, well, do you have any ideas of your own? And I said, well, you know, as someone who curates international biennials, it's always struck me as odd that the United States has never tried to have an international biennial. I mean, we have Santa Fe, but when you're 13 artists and shrinking, it's not exactly Venice or Sao Paulo. And I've always thought that we should have a proper international biennial so that we can actually have a global perspective on contemporary art that's presented in a non-commercial environment for the public. And she said, oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And where do you think that this biennial should happen? And I said, New Orleans. And this, another gasp, kind of like the Marcia Tucker gasp of 1982. Fortunately, this person, Jenny Frucci, thought this was a tremendous idea. Within 4 weeks of that meeting, I had a 3-year business plan to create the biennial and a promise of $500,000 in seed money to start it off with. So I had been an independent curator for about 12 years before joining the new museum, and I was an institutional curator at the new museum for over 11 years. Those two different experiences, I think, gave me the background I needed to become an entrepreneur, which was really what the situation demanded, and also to make the commitment to go out and raise several $1 million, which was the other thing that it demanded. So in January of 2007, I registered a new corporation in New York State called US Biennial Inc. and applied for a tax-free, tax-exempt status a few weeks after that, and then began assembling a team of people that would create the largest biennial, the largest exhibition of contemporary art in the history of the United States for the city of New Orleans. So on the one hand, I was trying to get 80 artists, and within a very short time, I contacted all 80, and I wanted artists who I thought could really respond to the situation, be sensitive to what the city was going through, but also be responsive to what New Orleans had to offer. My gamble was that all 80 of these artists would come to New Orleans and fall completely head over heels in love with the city. And in 77 of the 80 cases, I was right. So that was the starting point. And we decided to look at the city as an open-air venue in a different way than had ever happened before. Tourism in New Orleans is generally centered in two neighborhoods, the Vieux Carré, the French Quarter, and the Garden District, which all of you, I'm sure, have heard of. But some of the most beautiful and historic neighborhoods in New Orleans today are neglected. The Faubourg Treme, where I live, where I bought a house in 2007, is the oldest African-American neighborhood in the history of the United States. It's celebrating its bicentennial this year, and in about another couple of months, every one of you and millions of Americans will know the Treme because David Simon, who did The Wire, has started a new HBO series called Treme about musicians recovering from Katrina. So I think that's going to be dropping in March or April, and suddenly a third neighborhood in New Orleans will become a household name. The lower Ninth Ward, where the worst of the destruction had happened, was where more than a dozen of our artists' projects eventually took place. So as we were developing the exhibition, we decided that it had to link all of New Orleans, all of its most characteristic neighborhoods, from the furthest uptown bastions of white privilege to the devastation of the lower Ninth Ward, and many, many neighborhoods in between. So the idea of a tourist map that turned the city of New Orleans into a kind of an open-air gallery was part of the working premise. And in the end, we had about 24 venues, of which 18 are illustrated here on the perimeter of the map. I'm going to take you through some of the exhibition, maybe show you about 20 artist projects, just to give you a sense, for those of you who didn't well, even if you looked at the catalog, I don't think it really gives you a clear sense of what happened. And then afterwards, I'm going to distribute the map to you. What you just saw was one side of our map. On the other side is the actual guide to the exhibition and the 42 satellite exhibitions and 30 other venues that were going on at the same time. This is Tsai Guoqiang's project. Tsai never came to New Orleans, but I'm a big fan of his work, and we've collaborated in the past. And I had been thinking that even though he had a Guggenheim retrospective that was on the road, that somehow we could come up with a way of presenting his work in an innovative format in New Orleans. His technical director came in town and really viewed every possible site, every glamorous museum, atrium that we had in the city, rejected every single one of them, and was about to leave town without having found a venue when somebody said, well, why don't you take a look at the auditorium in the Charles Colton School. Now this was a middle school, a junior high school, in the Bywater neighborhood that had been abandoned after Katrina, but they were trying to revive it as artist studios. And the technical director walked into the auditorium, took a look around and said, this is it, we have our site. So the piece, which is called Fireworks, consists of these 5 gigantic elements. The largest one, the blue one in the foreground, the points actually extended to about 4 feet above the seats in the auditorium. So effectively about 1/3 of the space wasn't even usable to look at things on the stage. But this became an extremely popular piece, in part because I guess we need the lighting this way. I'd love to turn this off if I could, because I feel like it's taking away a little bit of the intensity of the image. Hold on. I think you can see it a little bit better. Off to the right are about a dozen electric massage chairs where everyone who came in to sort of gaze at this phantasmagoric spectacle in front of them could also lean back and get a nice shiatsu treatment at the same time. And this is a neighborhood where everyone was busy rebuilding, so neighbors would constantly come in and out, sit down in the chair for 20 minutes on their lunch break, and then head back without even looking at it. And we left most of them behind when the piece was finished. Arnold Mick, another artist who I've worked with a lot over the years, a Dutch video artist, wanted to make a special piece for New Orleans, but he doesn't really make his work about subjects that are, let's say, timely or derived from current events. But he decided to instead produce a movie that deals with the kind of sociology of post-catastrophic situations, and in particular the sort of security madness that we all deal with in airports in a post-9/11 society. And when I say madness, I don't mean that the security measures are in any way pointless, but rather that the kinds of behaviors that are reinforced, the almost total lack of any kind of human contact between passengers and security personnel, and how rigorously this is enforced, produces its own possibilities. So what he did was, all of his videos use only extras, for those of you who aren't really familiar with his work. So there were about 44, 45 people in this film, half of whom were security guards and half of whom were passengers. And the video is projected on 2 screens, it's silent, and about 55 minutes long. So you just go back and forth between these kind of languid scenes of people sitting forever in these transitional spots where they don't know where they're going. And then you would cut to more security rituals where there seem to be training each other in increasingly arcane practices of scanning, pat-downs. No one ever actually gets through the security, just the security guards in the film. But it was absolutely a very disorienting experience in New Orleans, if only because this sort of high technology environment that was being described seemed so much at odds with the texture of the city itself. Alexandra Arichea from Cuba, one of the founders of Los Carpinteros, who I've been working with for some years, had sent me a bunch of drawings about 6 months after Katrina, before I even announced that I was doing the biennial, in which buildings were set on chairs. And being from Cuba, which is often in the same hurricane path as New Orleans, he's seen his share of buildings and neighborhoods and communities flooded out or destroyed through hurricane. So once I'd seen a few of these images, I asked him to make a proposal for New Orleans, and he said, well, you know, I'd like to make a very large bucket, but I'd like to do it in a shape that New Orleanians themselves instantly recognize, but which may not be decipherable to someone else. So the Mississippi Gulf, the Mississippi River Gulf, the delta, as seen from the sky, would form the shape of the bucket. And we looked around for a large public space, not in part of an institution, and came across this plaza right outside of Harrah's Casino, about 500 feet actually from the river wall, where he built this large bucket that would simply fill up and drain, kind of functioning almost as a barometer after the fact, dealing with the climatological realities of New Orleans during the winter season. Zwelatum Fetwa from Cape Town was one of the visitors internationally who had just come to New Orleans for a tour, assuming that the city was rebuilt. And when he went to some of the neighborhoods like the Lower Ninth Ward and experienced what we all experienced, he was really deeply affected. He, I think, kind of came to the conclusion that what we were doing was a kind of a political statement, in that we were drawing attention to the situation in New Orleans through a biennial, but in a way exposing the failure of the public system to take care of it. So he did something he'd never done before, which is photograph outside of Africa. Up until now, his subject matter has been almost exclusively people living in squatter camps, or sugarcane workers, or people living in various transitory housing environments around Cape Town. That's been the subject of his work since the early 90s. But for the first time, he came back to New Orleans, spent about 2 weeks photographing, and then showed 14 photographs, 7 of which were from the Cape Town slums, and 7 of which were from the Lower Ninth Ward. And no one really could tell the difference unless they absolutely knew the particulars involved of whether you were looking at one of the poorest areas in the world, or, as I mentioned before, the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Adam Spijanovic was one of the artists who initially wanted to do something in the Lower Ninth Ward, and his proposal, which was very specific to the environment, was to create an all-encompassing image of the bayou. Because when you're in that part of the Lower Ninth Ward, you're very aware that the bayou is just at the edge of vision, and it's constantly encroaching on human civilization. So his notion was that Victorian wallpaper was often three-dimensional or hand-painted, and it often came in the form of a mural of the natural environment, of the ecosystem in which the house was developed. So we found a grocery store, or sorry, a general store that had been bought by a local choreographer, pardon me, named Greer Mendy, and she was converting it into a dance studio, so that the upper floor of this two-story building, which consisted of 4 separate rooms, became the basis for this wraparound wallpaper, in which what you were seeing was in a way a spectacle of the environment that was constantly just outside of the range of perception. This is the work of Sebastian Pries from Santiago, Chile, who does mostly works dealing with excavation of public sites in Santiago. What he did for this particular space, which is now called Tecrema Center for the Arts, was dig out all the areas of the floor that had been eroded and destroyed during the flooding and patch them using parts of houses that existed a mile or 2 away. So he would go and excavate pieces of cement that had been poured into the area, been poured into the ground for foundations, and place them not just in the patched areas of the floor, but also creating a kind of a almost natural history environment in which you stepped into the space and you saw the history of all the products that had been in the space, as well as the repair job or intervention into the space that Pries was trying to make as the practical application of his project. Janine Antoni was another artist who wanted to make a very specific work for New Orleans, but only referring obliquely to the situation. She specifically wanted to work with the idea of a wrecking ball, and presented this idea to me where she would make a wrecking ball from lead alloy, which was much, much softer than a regular wrecking ball, and used that ball to wreck a building. So this was the ball, and that's the building. And then after the building was wrecked, this is just outside of Binghamton, New York, she then had this wrecking ball. So it worked out so that after a single demolition of a building, the wrecking ball itself carried the traces of its own destruction. So this became part of the work, and then the other part of the work was started with a recording of the demolition, which was played back to the artist over speakers, over, a headset, in a video studio where her eye movements were tracked as she listened to the documentation, to the recorded evidence of the building being destroyed. And every time, of course, the ball hits the building, she blinks. It's an involuntary reaction. And the final installation simply consists of this large-scale projection of the artist's eye floating into space and staring at the ball, the wrecking ball, as the sound of the concussion fills the space and the eye continuously blinks. This mimicry of the orb of the eye and the wrecking ball, and of course the, I think, pretty obvious metaphor between creation and destruction, was never really pointed out, but it hung in the air in a truly powerful way. Miguel Palma from Lisbon was really struck with these World War II boats, these flat boats that had been developed for World War II in New Orleans. It's called a Higgins boat. They were especially useful for landings at Iwo Jima and other areas, but they were developed for fishing through swamps and getting through mangrove swamps and just allowing traction. In fact, during Hurricane Betsy in '65, Higgins boats were very much a part of the rescue effort, but they were no longer in circulation, obviously a few years ago. So this idea of creating a kind of environment using a Higgins boat morphed over the course of Palma's involvement with the project, so that what he finally created was a large-scale boat of the exact same scale as the Higgins on these kind of pneumatic pulleys that slowly lifted the piece up and then rocked it back and forth in space. The boat itself was filled up to the brim with water. So you climbed up the stairs, walked along the top of it, and then kind of observed. It's almost like a wave machine. The destruction and the drowning, the submersion of the space takes on a very hypnotic, soothing rhythm, so that even though the implication is of great destruction, the piece itself is incredibly relaxing to be around. Leandro Ehrlich from Argentina was just finishing this project when I gave him the invitation to participate in Prospect 1, and he said, I would very much like to do a new piece, but I think I've already done it. And really what he was looking for was just the right environment or the right space. So we showed him around the city, and eventually what he did was set up right near, this is the space he wanted to present his work in, and kind of an open field, which had once been a very crowded neighborhood, with these eerie stoops that you now find all over the lower Ninth Ward, which are really the only remains in many cases of the houses that used to be there. But what he finally chose was really a much more dramatic environment. It was right up against the levee, about 3 blocks away from where Paul Chan had done Waiting for Godot a year before, and snuggled up right against a house where the owners actually are still involved in trying to build the house back up. Now, this picture was taken right next to Brad Pitt's Make It Right housing projects, so that if you can imagine this very odd image of kind of destruction and danger being fronted by these science fiction looking houses in the neighborhood, it really was quite a very incongruous contrast, but drew a lot of people to this neighborhood to see it, I think, in a different way than they had been. For most people in New Orleans, I should mention, the lower Ninth Ward was a no-go zone. It took really people in the art world going through the lower Ninth Ward to convince people living in New Orleans that this was a really great place to go and look at art. And I think part of it had to do with the dedication of the artists involved to really make these projects relevant to the community. Happily Ever After was a proposal that Gada Amer had already done for a large outdoor sculpture park in the south of France. The idea of these become bases for vines, flowering vines that then spell out these words in space. Unfortunately, when we finally developed it in New Orleans, it was far too late in the planning season, so this kind of desolate area, which is really half a block from the Leandra Ehrlich that I just showed you, the words themselves stood out, but they stood out again against this backdrop of impending destruction. This was the site of Mark Bradford's piece, Mithra, and Mark was really the artist who kind of opened up the lower Ninth Ward for us. He had been one of the earliest artists to visit. He responded to the invitation from me very, very quickly and very specifically, saying that he wanted to build a 3-story ark like Noah in the lower Ninth Ward, very, very close to the bayou, because in his estimation, that was really what the neighborhood most needed, was something to escape on should the floods happen again. So this was a double lot in which he got permission from the neighbors to build without any extra permission or permitting. But the access to the lower Ninth Ward happened because on his second visit to New Orleans, the first visit was kind of a photo tour, Mark decided that the photos were not going to do it. They weren't going to direct him to the site for the work. The only way he could do it was to drive to the lower Ninth Ward himself and start meeting people and talking to people. And within about a day, he had met the owners of L9, Center for the Arts, photographers named Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick, who were lifetime residents of the lower Ninth Ward, who had lost most of their life's work in the floods, but had come back using a building that they had bought just before Katrina, which was not as heavily flooded as their home, which was gone. And instead of making a home there, they made an art center with the express purpose of letting people know from the neighborhood that they were back, that art was being shown, that culture had revived, and therefore that it was okay to come home if people were sitting on the fence. And it's been very interesting in the last couple of years of working with Keith and Chandra that the Holy Cross neighborhood where they live, which had about, I would say, 30 to 40% repopulation since Katrina, is now close to 75%. I mean, the neighborhood is almost at its pre-storm capacity, and it's the only neighborhood in the lower Ninth Ward that's like that. So you probably all have seen images of Mithra. This is the original artist's rendition of what it would look like. Here he is in South Central LA, building the work. Apparently got a few notices in the local press once it got up to its 3rd-story height. These containers, which you can see being wedged into the center, are actually the ballast to the boat. But once the ark was constructed, it was disassembled, packed into the containers, put on trucks and sent across country, and then when it was reassembled in New Orleans, the containers went right back into their position, holding the rest of the structure down. I have this partial view right after it went up, where you can see that all of the posters from the construction sites here in Los Angeles, which were deliberately left, he apparently had to look around to find a supplier of these plywood construction site barriers that hadn't scraped the posters off but left them on. So in a way there was this kind of transference of all of this sociological information from in LA street culture to New Orleans, and believe me, it was quite startling to local people there to understand that all the movies, all the concerts, all the films were different, that everything in LA street culture was indeed different. During the course of the biennial, of course, all of this, what Mark called the skin of the bark was slowly shed, so that in the end, all you really had was the plywood itself. This is actually Robert Green, one of our volunteers. This is his Christmas card from 2000, and a picnicking in front. If Robert's face looks familiar, it's because he was the poster boy for Paul Chan's poster for Waiting for Godot. He's really one of the founders of Common Ground and one of the most important neighborhood activists in the lower Ninth Ward. Neri Ward came into the project with a specific model in mind in his head that had to do with the Reverend Al Sharpton's kind of Center for self-empowerment in Harlem, near where he lives. The Sharpton headquarters happens to be an old boxing gym. And when it was changed from a boxing gym to a kind of social headquarters, they never really changed the decor. So this idea of physical development and community building somehow became something that Neri wanted to bring into his piece. So Diamond Gym was the name of the proposal, and the center of Diamond Gym is this gigantic diamond. It's about 10 feet high, made from welded steel, which the artist produced in New Orleans. And it's been erected in the center of an amazing building called Battleground Baptist Church. And Battleground derives its name from its location, its former location in the Battle of New Orleans historic site. The Battle of New Orleans didn't happen in New Orleans, it happened in Chalmette. And when they decided to make it a historic site, there were mostly working class, blue collar people living there. It was mostly an African American neighborhood. They told everyone to get out because it was turning into a park. So this particular congregation moved from Chalmette to this corner of the lower Ninth Ward, but retained the name Battleground from its original group. Well, they got washed out in Katrina as well, and the entire congregation was displaced to New Orleans East, but they were continuing to restore the church. Now, this is in an area where there's no businesses, no services, no schools, no stores, no restaurants. I mean, really no infrastructure at all, and yet the congregation was so proud of their church that they wanted to keep restoring it. They weren't even meeting there, and they had no intention to meet there in the future, and that's when Neri Ward met them. So they were extremely enthusiastic about supporting his project, to the point where many of them worked as volunteers in the actual installation of the piece. I'm showing you these two images of the interior just to give you a sense of just how visually spellbinding it was when you went into the space. The outer skin of the installation, in other words, when you walked around in the back, really revealed that what it was serving as for the community was a gigantic bulletin board, which it was surprising to me that Neri seemed to pinpoint this one obvious tool for knitting a neighborhood together, or the people in the neighborhood together, a bulletin board, and the fact that it wasn't there, that there was no place to go in that neighborhood to just find out what everyone was doing. So he went around to the neighbors and asked them all to bring in notices for meetings, petitions, just anything relating to the neighborhood. And by the time the exhibition was over, it had completely filled up several times over. I'm lingering on Neri's piece for another reason, because about 4 weeks before the close of Prospect 1, some residents of the lower Ninth Ward approached me and said, you know, we've been thinking about Prospect 1, which we like very, very much. We're happy that you've brought all these people here. We think the art is terrific. But you know what's going to happen when Prospect 1 is over, don't you? And I said, well, no, what? And they said, well, you know, at the museum, they're just going to go on to the next show. And at the Contemporary Art Center, they're just going to go on to the next show. But we don't have anything here. We don't have anything in our neighborhood. So why are you taking all this art away from us? And I just said, I don't know why. let's look at it again. So I talked to Neri, talked to all of the artists who had projects in the lower Ninth Ward, and in the end, 4 of them have remained behind. So when we open Prospect 2 at the end of this year, we're actually going to be reopening 4 of these projects in the lower Ninth Ward, and for the residents of the neighborhood, this idea that it might in fact develop into a kind of a sculpture park. No one's really placing designs on it, but that seems to be the inevitable outcome if we can get more artists participating in the neighborhood and more of them to agree next year to leave their pieces behind rather than just clean them out again. So this is going to be, I think it's going to turn into a very interesting outcome or accidental result of the biennial. Wageshi Mutu, another painter like Mark, came to the lower Ninth Ward, started talking to Keith and Chandra and said, I don't think my paintings are appropriate for this situation. I want to do something that's much more interactive. And she just started talking to neighbors and met Sarah Lasty across the street. And Lasty is one of those names that in New Orleans musical circles really resounds. Her husband was a great organ player. Her nephew is I think the greatest living jazz drummer of our time. Sarah lost her house. She had insurance money and she had road home money. So she had a nice chunk of cash after the storm to rebuild her house. She paid contractors to do the work. They put in an inferior foundation, and then they took the rest of the money and absconded. They vanished. So not only did she have no house and no money, but she was living in a one-bedroom apartment miles and miles away from her old neighborhood. And this is the situation that I guess she walked into. So she said, you know, what I'd like to do is to make your non-house, this ghost of a house, my project. What I'm going to do is create the skeleton of the house that was never built, just the frame. And I'm going to string it with lights so that every night when the lights go on in the neighborhood, suddenly the image of your house will come up again. It will be glowing. But on top of that, I want to turn this into something that's actually constructive for you personally. So the basis of my project is to create this image. The image will become the basis of a print. I'm going to sell the edition of the print, and hopefully, if everything works out, by the time the print's sold, we'll have enough money to build a house. Well, that's the image as of about 6 weeks ago. It wasn't taken by me or anyone on our team, but I think by sometime in March, Miss Sarah's house is going to be finished. So Wageshi's piece was not just a project for an 11-week-long biennial. It was a 1.5-year commitment to actually restore one person's house in the neighborhood. And needless to say, the opening of Miss Sarah's house was the occasion for about a 6-hour concert. It was one of the nicest programs in the entire exhibition. I'm showing you Paul Valinsky's emergency response studio. This is an actual FEMA trailer bought off of eBay that the artist decided needed to be converted into something that every artist needs, which is an all-green portable studio that will allow you to race to the site of a disaster and make your art. Go off the grid, but continue to have a place to work. I'm not getting much of a response from everyone saying, yes, that's exactly what artists seem to need, but that was his idea. So this is Socrates Sculpture Park, the summer of 2008. This is when he's gotten on the grid, where there's an entire solar panels and a wind turbine attached that's providing all the electricity to run the tools to convert the FEMA trailer into this beautiful home and work environment for artists that moved around the city during the course of Prospect 1. It started in the lower 9th Ward, then it went to the Colton School, and later on to Loyola University, and finally the New Orleans Museum of Art. Along the way, at least one neighborhood went off, like had a blackout at the time that the trailer was nearby. And I know this sounds apocryphal, it's not. He actually took his trailer and got everybody in the neighborhood hooked up onto the grid again using entirely passive energy collecting devices. This particular work has now been touring the country. It's been shown in about 4 or 5 different, mostly university museums since Prospect 2 closed. The US Mint is one of the kind of monuments and exhibition spaces that is most desirable to use in New Orleans. I'm going to show you a couple of projects that artists developed for the space. Sanford Biggers created an installation actually for Grand Arts in Kansas City, but he then presented it at New Orleans called Strange Fruit, where this oak tree seems to be coming out of the ground and continuing up through the ceiling. It is probably typically a hanging tree, and to kind of drive the point of the reference to the Billie Holiday song home, this piano, this baby or spinet piano, seems to be growing right out of the trunk of the tree, where the wood of the tree and the wood of the piano seem to fuse into a single almost molecular structure. And Sanford's own arrangement of himself singing Strange Fruit, it provides this audio background during the course of the exhibition. It was very powerful in the absolute kind of center of this historic site. Serjan Longkar, a Croatian artist who's been living in New Orleans for the past 15 years, created a piece in the Mint, in the old vault areas, where in one space you had these stacks of $10,000 bills. I'm sorry, stacks of $100 bills, each one forming kind of a $10,000 stack, all of course counterfeit or prints done on wood. And then in the other room, these piles of gold suitcases. And for about $500, you could go and take $1 million worth of money, fill one of these gold attaché cases with that $1 million and walk out with it, which people who did it said it was very, very therapeutic, especially during the early months of the recession. One of the things that I was trying to do in New Orleans, because I had become aware that a lot of artists of my acquaintance were making art about New Orleans, but that no one in New Orleans knew about it, was to make that connection happen. Fred Tomaselli had done a show in early 2007 at Jim Cohen in New York that was all about Katrina, this particular bead tree. It was a painting called Hangover. This is a work called Abductor. So what we did was gathered up most of these works, and he created a new one for New Orleans and brought them to New Orleans with the message that, you know, Tomaselli is an artist of great artistic weight in America, and you know, he's been thinking about you. So as isolated as you might feel after everything, at least derive some comfort from the fact that artists in our society are very, very preoccupied with the situation of New Orleans and trying to depict it through their art. Gajin Fujita from Los Angeles, I'm sure an artist many of you know, has this very particular way of combining traditional enameling and painting techniques with the kind of street art that he was used to growing up in Los Angeles. And he came to New Orleans completely obsessed with the way that New Orleanians identify with their NFL team, the Saints. Of course, a year ago, nobody had any idea they'd be going to the Super Bowl this weekend. But this idea that the Saints somehow are the spirit of New Orleans personified gave him this kind of artistic license to create this 23rd century sort of kabuki, warrior, troubadour character that just looms over the city and protects it. And I believe that this work is actually also going to remain behind in New Orleans for perpetuity. This is a work by Jackie Sumel in collaboration with Herman Wallace. Herman Wallace is one of the Angola Three. There are 3 Black Panthers who were imprisoned in Angola State Penitentiary around 1970 for political sedition. They were later, it seems, framed for the murder of a prison guard during a riot, and the Angola Three have been living in solitary confinement for the last 31 years. One of them, Albert Woodfox, was freed about 3 years ago, and when it started immediately lecturing around the country about the situation. The artist Jackie Sumel was a graduate student at Stanford, saw the lecture and decided that she was going to devote herself to this cause. And so what Albert said to her was that, well, you should be writing. You should start to become a pen pal with the 2 remaining prisoners. So she wrote to them, and Herman wrote back from his 10-foot by 14-foot cell where he's been living for 30 years. It's the longest case of solitary confinement in the country right now, the longest documented case. And it does seem to be that he'll be freed at some point. But Jackie identified herself, said, I would like to collaborate with you somehow. And he said, I would be delighted to. And she said, well, first, let me ask you a question. What do you do in a cell all day? What do you do in this box for all these years? And he said, well, I like to amuse myself by thinking about the home that I'm going to live in when I get out. And she said, well, what does that home look like? And he said, oh, I can describe every bit of it to you in detail, from the entry to the library, to the den, to the garden. So what began as this exchange became a collaboration where Herman, in his cell, is working through Jackie with about 6 architects in New Orleans, a number of community groups, and they have not only done models of Herman's house, they've done a animated cam rendition of it. The property has been purchased in Chantilly And as the case is now winding its way through the Supreme Court, it looks at if Herman doesn't have a complete house by the time he's out of prison, at least he'll have a lot more people galvanized in the direction of making it possible. So this display, which also included a life-size reconstruction of the cell that Herman lives in, was one of the pieces that you saw when you first walked into the Contemporary Art Center, where I'm also happen to be visual arts director. Jackie Terry and Brad McCallum, who formed the collaborative couple, McCallum and Terry, had approached me with a really beautiful project where the Montgomery, Alabama police station threw out a box, a cardboard box, about 10 years ago. And somebody picked up the box and looked through it and found the mugshots from the 1956 bus boycott, which was the first successful civil disobedience act that Martin Luther King carried out. These mugshots then found their way into civil rights historians' hands and became a kind of a legend. And Brad and Jackie said, we want to make a piece out of this. So they took the 113 mugshots, transformed them all into black and white silk screens. Those silk screens formed the front panel of a two-part screened painting where the image behind the black and white silkscreen is a hand-painted formal portrait done in China with some very specific recommendations by the artist. The portrait was to be done of a revered and venerated ancestor who had done great things in their lifetime. And that was what the instructions were. So the rendition of the subject of the black and white photograph becomes, you know, someone who's glowing, who's well-dressed, who's kind of got a halo around them. And you see these two images, one over the other, spread throughout the series of 113 images. They wanted to show the work at the CAC, and I persuaded them to have a look at the New Orleans African American Museum, which happens to be in Treme, and it's the old plantation house for Claude Treme, the man who had the brilliant idea in 1810 to start selling property to free people of color, thereby changing property ownership laws in the United States for the first time, more than half a century before Reconstruction, or before Emancipation. So the ground floor of the African American Museum became the stage for this work, which involved completely repainting and refurbishing the space right down to renting antique chandeliers that hung throughout the area. The back buildings of the African American Museum were projects by Rico Gatson and William Kentridge, respectively. So this kind of little neighborhood gallery or museum that really had, you know, maybe 20 or 30 visitors on a good weekend suddenly became one of the most popular venues in the exhibition, and they had something like 15,000 visitors over the 11 weeks of the exhibition. And like many other institutions, broke records. These are just some more installation views from the McCallum Terry piece. One of my favorite meetings of kind of an international art practice with local vernacular culture was the Navin Rawanchakul collaboration. I don't know if many of you know Navin's work. He's a Thai artist who was probably best known, at least in New York, for doing this piece called I Love New York Taxi. It's an ongoing project where he travels the world, befriends taxi drivers in some of the world's biggest cities, and then publishes comic books about the lives of taxi drivers. So that when you're in that city where he's made his piece, and you're in those taxis, you get a free comic book that shows you how really extraordinary taxi drivers are and how they become model citizens in their societies. Another project that Navin does is called the Navin Party. Being Thai and having the name Navin was a little difficult for him because Navin is an Indian name. It's not Thai at all. It's not Southeast Asian. And he was the only person he knew with that name. And he felt bad. So when he grew up, he said, you know, I'm gonna look for all of the Navins in the world who shouldn't have that name and who feel like they don't belong in society. And I'm going to create projects around them. So when Navin, for example, participated in the Shanghai Biennial, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, a local accountant named Navin Ho, I believe, became the subject of a kind of Maoist party event where thousands of people demonstrated in honor of this person whose distinction in life was that he had the same first name as the artist. The reason I'm giving you this explanation is because he approached us about doing the Navin party in New Orleans. And I said, hey, great, get started. Let us know what you come up with. And about a week later, he said, well, did you know about a famous jazz musician named Navin Kimball? And I said, that sounds weirdly familiar. And he said, yeah, he was a banjo player for the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, and he evacuated during Katrina and died in Georgia somewhere. And I said, you mean Narvin Kimball? And he said, well, here in this obit, which I found on, by Googling, it's Navin Kimball. Well, it turns out the accidental dropping of the R from Narvin Kimball's obits somewhere made him the subject of this piece. Well, after digging into Narvin Kimball's life story, and indeed he never came back to New Orleans, he died 5 months later, he didn't get a jazz funeral. And if you're a New Orleans musician, you are entitled to a jazz funeral, and the ritual is approximately that from the moment you die until the moment you're interred, the music never stops. So your comrades, your colleagues begin playing as soon as your death is announced, and then it just continues right up to the funeral. Well, this never happened for Narvin Kimball because people had other priorities. So Navin and Prospect One approached the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival Foundation, as well as the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, got in touch with the widow, Kimball, and his daughter, and said, as part of Navin's project, he wants to create a celebration of Narvin Kimball's life, and we want to have the jazz funeral that he never got after he died. Well, they were thrilled. They were absolutely knocked out. So the beginning of the piece were these painted murals done by Thai sign and poster painters that were hung all over town. This, in fact, was a billboard overlooking I-10, one of the major arteries through the city. And then on the day of the opening at 2 o'clock, his funeral left the Jazz and Heritage Foundation, which happened to be in a former mortuary on Rampart Street, and the members of the Preservation Hall Jazz Band saluted their fallen comrade 2.5 years later with a jazz funeral that, well, if you've never seen people holding up paintings of the deceased during a jazz funeral, that's because that's a Southeast Asian custom. So the blending of these two cultures, with Navin leading Narvin Kimball's daughter by the arm through this procession into the French Quarter, and to red beans and rice at Preservation Hall, was really one of the climaxes for a lot of people who came to the biennial. The self-taught artist tradition in New Orleans is very, very strong. You find it throughout the Deep South, as well as in part of the Midwest. Roy Ferdinand Jr. was an artist who I thought was an extraordinarily gifted artist who made a body of work in colored pencil and died in 2005. And then finally was sort of forgotten. And what I decided to do was put together a grouping of his work for Prospect One, in which people would have a chance to look not just at the way he rendered personalities and situations, but also the architecture. He had a real gift for just getting the edge of a shotgun house and the way buildings kind of line up behind each other in New Orleans neighborhoods, where people who are from the 7th Ward, which was his neighborhood, immediately know exactly where they are and in what part of the city they're in. And in fact, in many cases, they even know who the subjects are. Another example of the case of artists outside of New Orleans making work about New Orleans was Tony Fitzpatrick of Chicago. Tony's well known as a collage artist, but since Katrina, he had made dozens of collages in which the words of the images spelled out his feelings about New Orleans. 1,000 Beautiful Things is a song, actually by Annie Lennox, I believe, but John Boutte, the jazz singer, has done an amazing version of it. River Be My Door is an old blues song from the 20s that has to do with hurricanes and flooding. The Choctaw Dragonfly is part of the legend of the Choctaw Nation and escaped slaves in Louisiana is a very, very intricately interwoven history. And I think the reverence of the Choctaw people for the African-American population of South Louisiana continues to this day with constant references that mingle Indian mythology with local culture. A satin dress floating back is actually an eyewitness description from Katrina of someone sitting on their rooftop watching a satin dress floating by in the debris. Kay Rosen from Indianapolis, who'd gone to Newcomb, actually did an exhibition at Yvon Lambert that was all Katrina related in 2007, and wanted to do a project for us that was specific to the city. And what we ended up doing is taking this work in the back, which is titled The Back of the Boat. It can be read, oh no, oh Noah, oh New Orleans, on and on. And then the piece we wanted to do but never got a chance to do was Blue Monday, named after really one of Fats Domino's most well-known songs, and referencing the day that the levees broke, which is a Monday, August 30th, 2005. Monica Bonavicini came to New Orleans wanting to do a very provocative piece that dealt with the urban situation and crime. And after visiting the city and spending a few days, she wound up putting a very different kind of a public artwork on the roof of NOMA, in which Desire, of course the famous streetcar line that made New Orleans the subject of one of the great dramatic masterpieces of the 20th century, winds up being a very public statement in the middle of space. I'm just going to show you a couple more works, kind of more signature pieces from the biennial. Candice Brights proposed this piece called Legend that was done when she was in residency in Jamaica a few years ago. It's essentially working with members of a local Bob Marley society. And she approached them and asked them if they actually knew how to sing every song on the Legend album from beginning to end, from first song to last. And that's really Marley's greatest hits. So anyone who's a fan must know every song, every word. So what she did was get 36 people to have themselves videotaped singing without accompaniment. And that's really Marley's greatest hits. So anyone who's a fan must know every song, every word. So what she did was get 36 people to have themselves videotaped singing without accompaniment. There's a feed into their ears, so they have a track, but each one is reinventing the songs themselves, singing it the way they hear it, their version. And then she put all 30 versions together, a cappella, in this space where they're completely synchronized. No one's in harmony, everyone's in time with each other. But what's most amazing about it is that the creation of a completely new work of music is inescapable. The artist really insists that the piece be played very, very loud. So we had to shut an entire floor of the CAC just to contain the space, and you could even hear it coming in off the street. But once you entered the space, it was an extraordinarily powerful statement. And I guess the last artist I want to show, and this points a little bit to, I think, the future, is Victor Harris. One of the most enduring vernacular art traditions in New Orleans is that of the Mardi Gras Indians. About 110 years ago, African-American men began dressing up as Great Plains Indian warriors and parading through the back streets of New Orleans out of sight of the white authorities in the city and creating an alternate Mardi Gras tradition. It was very, very unsafe for blacks to do anything on their own in the middle of Mardi Gras, in the official spaces, because it simply wasn't safe. So this tradition has grown up over the years where there are actually two Mardi Gras in the city. One is a white tradition and one is a black tradition. The development of the Mardi Gras Indians, there are now about 14 different tribes, has focused more and more on the actual creation of what are called the suits. Now, these suits take about 8 months to make for each big chief, and it's worn for one day, just Mardi Gras Day, and then it's put away until the next year. So a retrospective of a Mardi Gras Indian would contain one suit equals 1 year's worth of work. Victor Harris was someone who I was very, very intrigued by, because he broke off from the tradition of the Yellow Pocahontas tribe, Trudy Montana's tribe, for those of you who actually know this arcane history the way I do. And Victor Harris in 1984 started his own group called Feher, in which the African headdress became an important part of the Mardi Gras suit. So up until that point, you had a headdress that revealed the face of the wearer. And when the big chief stepped out into the street, you knew who it was. But Victor's innovation was really to reference Africa in a very conscious way. And mind you, this is coming from someone who really has a 7th grade education. So to say that he's referencing Africa means that he's conjuring Africa from his own mind and creating these suits that actually are as much a figment of his own imagination as anything else. We took one of the central galleries in the New Orleans Museum of Art to present this mini survey of Victor's work, and not just the suits themselves, but also pretty rare video footage of him coming out on Mardi Gras morning in this moment that you see. It's before he dons the mask, but just to really give out-of-towners a sense of the extraordinary intensity and richness of vernacular street traditions in New Orleans. And I think every reviewer, from the New York Times to the New Yorker to certainly every major art magazine, singled out Victor Harris as one of the most impressive artists of the exhibition. Well, for me, this was an important vindication of what I'd set out to do, which is not just to try to raise New Orleans up in the eyes of the art world, but to also say that this is a city that has a contemporary art tradition. Granted, what you or I do when we go to galleries and museums, and what we see and what we seek out, it could not be as different from a Mardi Gras suit. And yet, the fact that this is a sculptural tradition and that enormous amounts of talent and skill and creativity go into making these suits means that as we're starting to maybe adjust our ideas to how contemporary art gets shown in a public sphere in this country, we can also start to adapt our definition of what contemporary art is and perhaps open it up more broadly to this kind of practice. So I'm going to just close by giving you a little bit of statistics. We had about 90,000 admissions for Prospect 1, which turned out to be about 45,000 bodies. The entire exhibition was free. So not only could you enter all the galleries for free, the map was free, and the shuttle was free to get you all around town. Nonetheless, we had about 24,000 out-of-town visitors of the 45,000 that came, and the economic impact for the city was about $24 million. So we've announced Prospect 2 will open on November 13th of this year, and we hope that by the time we get to Prospect 5, if I'm not completely worn out to a nub by having done this, that hopefully the United States will have a true biennial of its own. And I think in a way that reflects the best aspects of our culture and our society, it will be the first time an international biennial has occurred for almost entirely humanitarian purposes. So I don't want to take anything away from the art, but really the reason I did this was not to give myself a gig, but to really allow the art world to participate in a very meaningful way in the rebuilding of New Orleans, and I hope the eventual recognition of New Orleans as one of the true priceless and irreplaceable cultural treasures of the United States. So thanks very much. So if we can have the lights back on.
Do you want to take a seat maybe in front?
Sure.
To answer some student questions?
Yeah. Here's a good seat.
Whatever you're more comfortable with.
I'd like to sit down. Yes.
So, I mean, you've been very generous with your time here and discussing the artworks.
There are maps for everybody, by the way. Yes, sorry.
No. In discussing the artworks themselves, I'm hoping we might be able to sort of change gears and focus on the curatorial initiatives and strategies in Prospect 1 and looking ahead to Prospect 2.
Mm-hmm.
a number of us here were fortunate enough last night to go see Paul Chan's lecture at Red Cat,
Right.
where he specifically focused for 2 hours on his work that he did, the project of working as an artistic director and producing and staging Beckett's Waiting for Godot in New Orleans. And what was one of the focuses in my mind with this talk last night by Paul Chan was that, you know, the play wasn't enough, as he said last night. He said that in doing this work in New Orleans after Katrina, that there needed to be a sort of series of initiatives, artist-led efforts beyond just staging this artwork itself, this play.
Mm-hmm.
And he went into sort of specifics of that. And so I'm wondering, you know, shifting from sort of the role of the artist to your role as the curator, what are some of the sort of specific strategies or initiatives that you conceive, Prospect 1, Prospect 2 in mind, in sort of enveloping the artworks themselves, in sort of developing maybe, you know, specifically a sense of sustainability or sort of sustained strategies in New Orleans, again, beyond sort of the event of the Biennale itself, or beyond the artworks specifically themselves?
That's a good question. It happens on a lot of different levels. For me, the idea that this was a long-term commitment, that I wasn't going to do what Paul did, say, which is come in, do an event, and leave, that I would actually come and I would stay and be part of the community more or less from this day forward. That defined what my priorities were when I was developing the project, because I thought that it would, whereas it would be very exciting to have this wonderful exhibition, should it turn out to be a one-off, that there would be no sustainability if it was a one-off. So we set up a couple of structures, and one of them that I'll really emphasize is that we strongly promoted a system of what we called satellite exhibitions. So the satellites work by explaining, first of all, to New Orleanians that international biennials, like the ones that I'm trying to do, can't overload the number of local artists in it. That 15%, maybe max 20%, something like that, of local artists would be about the right proportion. If you had more than that, no one would come. So what happens is, for example, with Prospect 1, we had 80 artists, 11 of them were Louisiana-based. Obviously, there are hundreds of artists working in New Orleans, and a number of them whose work I support. So we started about a year out in having talks, going to the different cooperative galleries, going to meetings of artist groups. And what I would say to people was, the number of artists from this community participating in Prospect 1 is barely scratching the surface. But it needs to be this way for the reasons I just explained. What I'm throwing out to all of you is, you can take this initiative, take advantage of the tens of thousands of very well-informed and often very well-heeled art viewers that come to the city, and stage exhibitions. So we just actively promoted this idea that in New Orleans right now, it's quite easy to get your hands on space without having to pay money. And we knew that a lot of artists had that opportunity. So we said that if you create these exhibitions, we're asking you to commit to the same dates, to commit to a reliable opening schedule, and that's all you need to do, and we will promote what you're doing. We will market all of these satellite exhibitions along with the biennial. So a satellite exhibition was anything that was done as a one-off, is part of a not a continuing program, but in a space that happened just at the same time as Prospect. So as I said, there were about 30 of those, and about another 30 already existing spaces around the city presented their programs at the same time. So we tried to make sure that the idea of New Orleans as an art city, as a place where it would seem as if all we do all day long is look at art there, would be conveyed and expressed to visitors, so that they would begin to interact in very direct ways with the artists and the communities themselves. So that's on the level of exhibiting. Our education program, which was maybe the most, I'd say, important kind of grassroots initiative, really involved doing a lot of teachers' workshops, doing curriculum development, and creating some kids prospect exhibitions that were happening at the same time as the exhibition, but actually resulted in the production and presenting of works. We had probably somewhere around 1,500 students come to Prospect One as part of our field trip programs, and I think we probably did about 220 individual teacher training workshops as well. So being able to promote visual art in the education system in New Orleans is extremely important to our mission. Right now, if you have musical talent, somewhere along the way, someone will spot you in New Orleans education system and give you an opportunity to show your stuff. That doesn't exist right now for someone who happens to be visually inclined. So we're trying very much to balance that as well. And of course, I'm the artistic director I'm the visual arts director for the CAC. So part of my work on a week-to-week basis involves collaborating with New Orleans-based artists and presenting their work as part of an ongoing operation. So I think the way that we sustain the biennial over the years will have to do with being much more close to the ground in terms of community organization and collaborating with neighborhood groups. But we already have that set up. We now have an office in New Orleans. I'm there half the time. We have 2 staff members who are there full-time. And we have a lot of consultants that we work with and about 300 volunteers. So already the kinds of community initiatives that are growing to support Prospect One are having the kind of secondary effect of galvanizing the visual arts producers in the community to take more of their own future and their own situation into their hands. So is that sort of get at what you were asking, or am I leaving out?
Yeah, I mean, it's Paul Chan also had talked about sort of setting up workshops and sort of education programming that would have a sort of lasting effect of exhibition programs that would kind of continue on. So you're talking about a number of things, but one of the things you're discussing is sort of exhibitions beyond the Biennale, after the Biennale, well after the Biennale, in fact.
Right. There are the St. Claude corridor that I briefly mentioned, which the Colton School was on. I would say during the 4 months prior to Prospect One opening, about 5 different artist cooperatives opened up suddenly to take advantage of Prospect One. And I mean, I think it's indicative of the art market there that it's been very hard for anyone who's not like a baby boom generation to in any way get an audience or get support. So what happened was there were a lot of artists, kind of born in the 70s and 80s, who decided to take these spaces, open them up, form cooperatives, and start exhibiting as galleries because they didn't have representation elsewhere. Well, all of these galleries are still going. I mean, Prospect One closed more than a year ago, and all of these co-ops are still going strong. So we feel that this is a direct outcome of what we did. And again, I don't want to take anything away what Paul did, but he was there for a year, and when Waiting for Godot ended, he left, and he hasn't been back. So I think he recognized what needed to be done, and I think he's planted certain seeds to make things happen. But now, what we need to do is get Paul to come back and do more in the community, because I think that getting artists to return to New Orleans and do collaborations with people in the city is really what's going to, I think, trigger the kind of transformation of the city that's my goal.
Are you interested in
It's understood.
Sure.
We have limited time, so.
Sure.
I'm interested, you spoke about that when you came back, you were identifying really the cultural identity of New Orleans, and you identified it three legs, which were the architecture and history, the cuisine, and the music, right?
And what I left out is that we're trying to create the fourth leg.
Right, I was going to ask that. That's actually my question. Like, and then you went visual arts. So, I guess if you could talk to kind of this idea of if there really were these things that were so much the cultural legs, and obviously that had such a profound impact on you, the cuisine, the music, you know, that gave you your, you know, aha moment, where you saw kind of the leap to then the visual arts as being something that would rebuild the cultural identity of the city.
What was the question part again?
Essentially that if there were these three legs that were already clearly established as this cultural identity of New Orleans that has been there forever, you know, where the connection to then this fourth leg came from.
Because it's the only way that I could contribute. I mean, it seemed to be the only way that I could be something, that I could play a role in the cultural rebuilding of the city, where I wouldn't just be another person, like with a shovel. You know, because it seemed that if I was just being part of a large group of people helping to build houses or helping to dig things out, then the extent of my contribution would be limited to my physical ability to dig or to build or be part of a team. And I wanted to do something that would benefit the city. And I thought that it was really ideally suited for a whole lot of reasons that I don't know if I can dwell in now, but when you sit down and you think about all the characteristics a city needs to be a great biennial location, New Orleans actually has them all. But the gamble for me was based on the idea that there had to be enough art in New Orleans that would sustain this kind of prolonged attention. So if we were to say to people, come to New Orleans for contemporary art reasons, well, what would that mean? I mean, it would have to mean that there are enough artists in the community doing interesting work that if you start looking, you're going to find that work. And believe me, when you're operating in the shadow of a Miami Basel, for example, where I don't know if anyone here is from Miami, but you know, there's no art community in Miami. I mean, there's no gallery system, there's no artist community system. There's basically collectors in New Orleans. And I thought, well, New Orleans doesn't have collectors, it doesn't really have museums, but if it has artists, I mean, if there's a community where the work that's being made in New Orleans is exciting enough, and if artists around the country are moving to New Orleans, as designers have been since the storm, and architects, then we can create a kind of persuasive argument that this is the case. And I'm really relieved to say that over the last couple of years, I've gotten involved in the careers of a couple of dozen New Orleans artists, and I think that I think the city has what it takes to sustain this over time. But again, you're going to have, what I'm asking the biennial visitor to do is to broaden their idea of what an artist is, so that it's not just conceptual art or installation or painting or sculpture, that drawings by self-taught artists, Mardi Gras Indians, all of this can be considered contemporary art practice. And if we can accept that, then we can accept that what New Orleans offers is very, very, what it brings to the occasion is very rich and very plentiful. You had a question.
I did. What might you like to do differently the second time around?
Well, we've already focused on a couple of things that we're going to do very differently. We've become very neighborhood-centric. So the map I showed you doesn't separate the city by neighborhood. And what we found was that everyone could remember the lower Ninth Ward, and people could remember the French Quarter, but that most people had no idea, besides those two neighborhoods, where they were when they were in New Orleans. This year, the biennial will happen in 7 neighborhoods. And when you're in that neighborhood, you'll know where you are, because we're going to try to make each neighborhood a kind of a destination unto itself. Probably our shuttle system will adapt accordingly. We had one shuttle that took you through the entire city, and the wait between shuttles was about 40 minutes. And in the lower Ninth Ward, we had a mini shuttle that just took you around the lower Ninth Ward every 15 minutes. I think what we're going to do for Prospect 2 is have a mini shuttle in every neighborhood. So right now Our new neighborhood this year is a neighborhood called Central City, which is a fantastic neighborhood. It's really, really great, but it's definitely in transition right now. So we're working with them to find schools, churches, neighborhood associations, as well as galleries and media centers and almost anything that would resemble a museum or a gallery in the neighborhood, and work with them not just to develop the Prospect 2 sites, but to also map the neighborhoods in a way that somebody who comes to see the 4 venues or the 5 venues in Central City also get directed to a place to eat. They also get directed to historical and cultural sites of significance in the neighborhood. They get pushed to the retail places if there's artisanal work or any kind of handmade local products for sale. We'll push people in that direction. We're even setting up info kiosks to greet people at the main venue in every neighborhood, so that we can pass out a lot of propaganda for all the community organizations that people might want to get involved in. So our idea is spend a day in Central City, spend a day in Treme, spend a day in the French Quarter. You know, I shouldn't disguise the fact that the tourism dimension of this is very, very explicit, and there's not a drop of irony in our position about it. You know, I know a lot of, but a lot of biennial curators get twisted up in this. They just torture themselves about this theoretical or hypothetical problem of collusion between critical and curatorial practice and the sort of the gross heads and beds calculus that go into tourism statistics. Well, I'm all about tourism. That's really my #1 goal, is to make every single living, breathing person in the art world so interested by what we're doing that they just have to come to New Orleans and see it for themselves. And in so doing, this particular constituency, the cultural tourist visitor, brings so much with them of benefit to the community that I don't think you can compare it to other places where this fear that the art hordes will come through like locusts, you know, and just strip everything bare, or you know, that they would somehow exploit the situation in an unsavory way. I think New Orleans, its own history of whoring itself for tourism purposes, you know, really since emancipation. I mean, this is the city that invented tourism in our country. They have a sense of themselves and what's real and what's artificial and what's authentic and what's done just for the tourists, where I think the balance can be preserved without a whole lot of danger. I actually think the MTV-ization of Mardi Gras has harmed New Orleans much, much, much more than any number of art tourists could do, because the art tourists bring something really valuable to the city that the city needs. And part of it is sensitivity and perception. People that really know how to look, they look at New Orleans and they can't believe what they're seeing. And the people in the city kept saying that the thing that was the most healing about Prospect for them was to see all these really sophisticated people, you know, well-dressed people, talking about how beautiful the city was. And New Orleanians hadn't heard that since Katrina. No one had been telling them that they live in a beautiful city. And they needed to hear that. It was part of the healing process. And to have all these archetypes come in going, oh, your city's so beautiful. I mean, people would just weep openly because it was hitting them right where they live, literally. So yeah, I may be protesting too much about that, but yes, well, yes, you first, and then you.
I read in an article that you're charging this year for
Yes,
Prospect 2.
we are indeed.
And I was just kind of curious, since it was free in the first phase, like why you guys decided to charge and where the money's going to go, and you know. Also, as a follow-up question, you said you guys made $24 million in revenue, is that right?
No.
Sorry.
No. The economic impact, the direct economic
Sure.
impact for the city of New Orleans, hotels, restaurants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, was $24 million.
Okay, thanks. That clarifies a lot.
We'll be charging, we've been trying to come up with we've been trying to scale admissions in a way where locals won't feel it's too expensive and out-of-towners won't feel like they're totally getting away with a scam. We'll probably charge $10 for a day pass, $20 for a week pass, and $30 for a season pass, for biennial pass. And we'll have Friday free for Louisiana residents. I really don't like two-tiered admissions, so we decided one price for everybody, and then Fridays will be like family day. That money will go to offset expenses. We ran up a healthy deficit the first time around. We had a $4.2 million project that wound up costing about $4.8 million. And a lot of the big foundation funding for New Orleans ended last year. So a lot of the big groups like Getty, who had a very, very generous New Orleans initiative, it's all over. So we made it free because we wanted it to be a gift to the city of New Orleans. But New Orleans accepted the gift, they liked the gift, and now we're saying to them, okay, it'll cost you about what it'll cost you to see a movie, to see the next edition of the biennial. I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of pushback, but it means we'll make $800,000 or $900,000 that we weren't able to make the first time around. So it's worth doing. You have a question?
Yeah, well, you spoke a little bit about, I guess, like initiatives to sort of engage the residents in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if you could talk or speak a little bit about sort of the reception that you got on the ground from the residents, both during and after the biennial.
Well, I would love to say that there were some instances of resistance or resentment or criticism. But there are none that I can recall, and I think what's very particular about the culture in New Orleans is that it's a very intimate social framework that people operate in. People touch much more and they're close. There's kind of personal space that we all have. It doesn't work in New Orleans. No one's got personal space. No one wants it. And I found that I had to ask myself why I was getting away with all this stuff. I was like, why are they letting me do this? And somebody sat down with me and they said, to a New Orleanian, Dan, it is so obvious that you are in love with this city. You just ooze this kind of like starry-eyed romance that you've got going around with the city of New Orleans. They see that, they recognize that, and they just say, you can do anything you want to do. And I think that's probably the case, because to this day, I sit back and I think, I can't believe we got away with some of the stuff that we did. And part of it was just because the message that what we're doing was good for the city, and it was coming from a place of kind of a reverence for what the city has. And I guess this comes after, and especially the post-Katrina era, where you had a lot of carpetbagging, you had a lot of people, Ed Blakely, the reconstruction czar, anybody, good thing too. I mean, this man left New Orleans November of last year, and I mean, he could not have gotten out of town fast enough. He convinced nobody in the city that he had any respect for the culture at all. And this is the man that was supposed to be channeling hundreds of millions of dollars of congressionally legislated recovery money. He was a disaster. I mean, he just failed completely at his job. But even more than that, he dissed New Orleans when he was talking about it in Washington or LA or New York. He was just, he was quoted once as saying it's a backwater of bumpkins or something. Just his condescension to the city was great. And believe me, New Orleanians put up with this a lot. They really, a lot of people come to the culture, don't care about it, say, you poor people, you don't even know what's good for you, let me help you. let me fix what you've got wrong, because it's so glaringly apparent to me that you have all these problems. Well, that just meets with a total wall of resistance. And then finally, I think the biggest thing about Prospect that they let me get away with it was that everyone has broken their promise to New Orleans. Everybody. I mean, the president, the mayor, this Ed Blakely dude. I mean, everybody promises things to New Orleans and then doesn't deliver. And once they realized that I was not backing down, that I was going to open this biennial no matter what, they just were like, go, Dan, go. I mean, it was just all about, you're doing this for us, you know, we've got you. And, you know, not a day goes by when a stranger doesn't come up to me in a grocery store, tell me what a great thing the biennial was, and how can they sign up to volunteer. So in some way, we're trying to be just a symbol for the city's new identity, its renaissance, its cultural renaissance. But for the city's own consumption, not just for ours, but for the city to get this feeling like we're all going to get on Sunday after the Saints win the Super Bowl, of what it feels like to be not a loser. Because the country really thought of New Orleans as just the biggest loser, you know, after Katrina. And you know, we're a society of winners. We don't like it when people lose. We like our underdogs, but only after they win. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Could you address some of the problems you faced getting Prospect 1 off the ground, and now some that you're facing in its second iteration, and similarly how your priorities have shifted now that, you know, this is going to be a multi-year project?
Well, the biggest problems were really logistical. I mean, it was you know, they were just these wild realizations. It's so, like, we wake up 5 months before the biennial, and I looked at my exhibitions manager, and I said, we've got to start interviewing security companies, because we're going to have to hire 18 uniformed security guards for 9 of our venues. Where do you go to find security? Like, these kinds of things where we suddenly realized that we didn't just have to solve the immediate problem, but we had to actually create an infrastructure within the organization that allowed us to do it on an ongoing basis. The logistics were really the worst part.
And what about, like, within the art world? I mean, getting people down there and...
No, the art world was amazingly generous and responsive. Miami was the problem, you know, because they couldn't quite believe that New Orleans had gotten all this attention during their season, during their moment. But, you know, we had an amazing response from Houston, Atlanta, and New York. We had the Santa Monica Museum brought a big group, and then MoCA brought a group after them. No, they're really, it's hard to make it sound credible, but there were no real obstacles other than logistics. It was a little scary when we thought we didn't have enough money. We thought, oh my God, we're going to have to shut the whole thing down, and this big triumph is going to wind up being a big disaster. And that didn't happen. So my worst fears weren't realized. No, wait, there was one problem. City Hall. The mayor, you know, we raised about close to $5 million to do this. The Lieutenant Governor of the state of Louisiana gave us a grant from the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism for $300,000, which is a nice, healthy grant. We went to the city of New Orleans to see if we could match it. We not only didn't get a dime, we actually got this amazing runaround. And the last letter we got from Ed Blakely, that's fine, I keep mentioning him, was, your application has been received, it's been processed, you will be hearing from us shortly. So 14 months later, we not only didn't get the money, we didn't even get the dignity of a reply. So the fact that there will be a new mayor in New Orleans on June 1st is a sign of enormous relief to everybody, because this, you know, like the president, this is the worst mayor that New Orleans has had in its history. So finally, I think the country and the city can move on to better days.
Hi, so I was actually one of your out-of-town visitors to Prospect One, and it was my first trip to New Orleans, and that was my only map of the city, and your shuttle was the only way I could get around. And it really like changed my whole idea of what New Orleans was, because I never thought of it as a visual arts destination. You talked a little bit about how you're continuing to support the local art community. How do you think their involvement in Prospect 2 is going to be different than in Prospect 1? And do you have like a vision, maybe like a 10-year vision, you talked about Prospect 5 or whatever, for what the local arts community can become?
Well, one of the things that I've been trying to do is work a lot with the New Orleans arts community in my capacity as the visual arts director at the CAC. I've also been trying to do a lot of exhibitions outside of New Orleans, of New Orleans artists. So I'll probably be doing something in Marfa, Texas this year. I have something next month in New York showing different artists. I mean, I guess what I'm really trying to do as well is to raise the bar locally for how connoisseurship happens. The reason that there aren't any really good contemporary art collections in New Orleans is not because there aren't people with resources or means to do it. It's because there's just never been anybody locally to kind of leverage what they have locally with this kind of this idea of national exposure. So I'm trying to do as much as possible to work as directly with the artists as I can over time, and I guess really you kind of like bang the drum for New Orleans culturally with the rest of the country. This is all I do now. I have other projects that I'm doing, but if you were to ask me to lecture about, what I did at the new museum, and I only left the new museum like 3 years ago, I could barely even construct it at this point because Prospect has completely taken over my life, so that my mission now and for the foreseeable future is Prospect. That being said, one of my biggest goals for the biennial is to not keep curating it myself. In fact, I think by number 3, I'll be ready to pass it off to either a guest curator or perhaps a small group of guest curators, because it just shouldn't be overly identified with one person. I think I need to do 1 and 2. I mean, I needed to do 1 and I need to do 2. But after a certain point, if it's established, then it needs to be able to function without me as the curator, as the artistic director. I mean, I would continue to be the fundraiser, but what I would like is that, hopefully by Prospect 6, I'll be in my garden puttering around, and a whole new group of people will be able to lead it to 7, 8, 9, and 10, and from that point on. Yes?
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the challenges that you had with kind of with the city government in producing Prospect 1, and then also like how you think the new mayor will receive you in Prospect 2.
The most daunting challenge we faced with the city administration was permitting. We had a number of things that we were doing that were not at all kosher, either for zoning laws, construction laws, and what I needed to do at a certain point was to go to someone who had approached me early on and said, the day will come when you'll need me for this. So I'm offering my services right now, and let's see what happens. This person is is the principal of the largest architectural firm in the city, and he not only designed for free a number of secondary structures to the biennial, he also sat down with our team and went project by project with us and said, okay, well for that one you need a special kind of temporary housing permit, but for this other one you need a permit that does such and such. Broke all of our different permitting requirements into the respective categories, and then went with us over to see the different people in all the different departments to just ram it through the administration. So we had all of our permitting done in 2 weeks, whereas if we had tried to do it ourselves, it never would have happened. So things like that, like just having one person be an intermediary for you who knows how the system works and knows how to, what's the word, to supersede it or to work around it is essential in a situation like that. Yeah.
You spoke a little bit about the reception on the ground. I'm curious about the reception in the art world specifically. What would you say the biggest critiques of Prospect 1 were, and what are you doing in Prospect 2 to address them?
Well, the most of the reviews that I read were pretty positive. I think that the one thing that was maybe the hardest for critics to comprehend was the notion of a shared venue. Along with our venues and the satellite venues, we had some venues that were both at the same time. And that was quite daunting for people from New York. I mean, one example was the Universal Furniture Store, also on St. Claude Avenue, which was, it was filmed a lot. You saw it a lot on CNN after the flooding because it really was looted in a quite spectacular way where they smashed through the second-story windows and started throwing mattresses and sofas and big armchairs out. You saw people just I mean, the whole place was stripped. So the local police precinct, which was also flooded, moved in shortly after the storm and took over the central part of the store. The owner then offered it to us as a venue, but said, we're going to do a big group show of neighborhood artists at the same time. And so I thought, okay, we've got a big collective group show to the left, a police precinct right ahead of me. What should we put in our space? And I thought, Piety, like the most elegant, overly produced, like high gloss production works of the exhibition, the most artificial work in the show, seemed to be the perfect thing in this space. Well, I found it to be really exciting and amusing, and local people thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever come across in their life. But out-of-towners seemed to get really incensed. They couldn't figure out what the police were doing there, and they couldn't figure out and they certainly couldn't understand why Pierre Gilles had agreed to this. Of course, Pierre Gilles had no idea that I was doing this, but those kinds of, like, this kind of mingling of the local and the out-of-town in a way that made it almost deliberately confusing was maybe the thing that we got slapped around about the most in terms of the art critic press. And I'm probably going to do it exactly the same way the second time around because in that sense, I don't really care. I mean, I find that if it makes sense locally, then that's what's most important to me. If New Orleans think it's cool or fun, and to me it's valid in terms of my own relationship to my own practice, then I simply, I really stopped internalizing what critics write about in my own work a long, long time ago. So as happy as I was that most of the reviews for Prospect 1 were very, very positive, the truth of the matter is I can't remember most of what anybody said that was critical. But I do remember that part because it was the one thing where I thought that actually the out-of-towners wound up looking kind of foolish for making too much of it. But aside from that, I'm not really, that aware of kind of constructive criticism that I later said, oh, I can really internalize this and do something with it. I think most people were so shocked that we actually did it, that we pulled off something that was really world-class in a city that was still crippled. I think that really knocked people out, and they kind of couldn't really find much room to say other things. High production values is really something I'm very committed to with this kind of a project, so that the work itself, so that every artist goes away feeling that their work looked amazing in the space, and that's, to me, the commitment to the artist is primary.
I think unfortunately it's 10 to 9. I think we have to kind of wrap up. Thank you so much. This is really informative, and I think also just inspirational in terms of, you know, your willingness to share your own particular, you know, relationship to this place. And I think also the history that you offered also was very helpful as well. I think that there may be, we might facilitate communications with you between the students for opportunities maybe that might arise in terms of internships perhaps in the future with Prospect 2. So that's something that we can discuss at another time. But,
That'd be great. We have a group coming from the Royal College in London of postgraduate curatorial candidates.
during the opening?
From June to September.
June, September.
And then from September on, we have a graduate class of art history students from LSU who will be coming down to intern for the whole fall during the installation. So we are very, very active and very open to working with the interns of any kind. So if people want to approach us about it, I'd be happy to. I can leave my card.
Terrific. All right. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks for that.